She had fired 400 people that quarter and hadn't lost a single night of sleep. One cardboard box stopped her cold. Not because of what was inside it, but because of what was left behind. A photograph, a little girl's handwriting, and 9 words that a $30 billion empire couldn't answer. This is the story of what happens when the most powerful woman in the room finally meets the one man she cannot buy, cannot replace, and cannot forget. If you're new here, subscribe now and stay until the end. Drop your city and country in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button, because you will not want to miss a single word of what comes next. The morning Ethan Mercer lost his job, he packed his entire 8 years into a cardboard box in under 15 minutes. That was the part that got him afterward, not the firing itself. Not the way HR had slid the termination paperwork across the table like they were handing him a parking ticket. Not even the careful, rehearsed language the woman from HR used. The kind of language designed to say, you're done, without ever letting those exact words leave her mouth. What got him was the 15 minutes. 8 years of showing up on time, of covering shifts nobody else wanted, of quietly solving problems that would have cost the company serious money if left alone. And all of it fit inside a medium-sized cardboard box with room to spare. He stood in the break room for a moment after he'd cleared his desk, holding the box against his chest. The coffee machine was running. Someone had left a half-eaten blueberry muffin on the counter beside it. The lights buzzed faintly overhead the way they always had. That low electrical hum that Ethan had stopped noticing years ago, but noticed now, probably because he understood he wouldn't be hearing it anymore. He'd worked on the 3rd floor of Northvale Dynamics for 8 years. 3rd floor, East Wing, the department that handled operational logistics, the invisible machinery that kept everything else moving without anyone upstairs ever thinking twice about it. He thought twice about it until something broke, and Ethan was usually the one who fixed it. He adjusted the box under his arm and walked back through the office. Few coworkers looked up. Most of them looked away quickly, the way people do when something uncomfortable is happening, and they're grateful it isn't happening to them yet. Danny from accounting gave him a small nod, the kind that means I'm sorry, and I'm scared it's my turn next in the same gesture. Ethan nodded back. He didn't stop to shake hands or make speeches. He wasn't wired that way. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. Celeste, Rowan's office, was on the 14th floor. Ethan had been up there exactly twice in 8 years. Once for a company-wide town hall when Celeste had first taken over. As CEO, she'd been 26 years old, then already running a company worth more than most countries' GDP, giving a speech about vision and excellence and setting the standard while the employees below her clapped and tried to figure out whether she was impressive or terrifying. The answer Ethan had decided was both. The second time was a maintenance issue. A pipe had burst in the ceiling above the executive suite. He intervened. Ethan had coordinated the repair crew at 11 o'clock at night so that the damage would be fixed before the markets opened in the morning. He'd never told anyone he'd done it. It wasn't the kind of thing you brought up. Never spoken directly to Celeste Rowan. She didn't speak to people like Ethan. That wasn't cruelty. It was simply the mathematics of a large corporation. The CEO managed directors. Directors managed managers. Managers managed the people who actually kept things running. The system worked by keeping those layers separate. Yep. Ethan understood that. He'd never once resented it. When the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, Ethan didn't press the lobby button. He pressed 14. He wasn't sure later why he'd done it. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to plead for his job back. Ethan Mercer had never been the kind of man who argued and pleaded, not because he was without pride, but because he'd learned a long time ago that a man who has to beg for his dignity has already lost it. Maybe he just needed her to see him. Not his employee number, his position code. Not the line item on a restructuring spreadsheet. The 14th floor was quieter than the 3rd. The carpet was thicker up here, actual carpet, not the thin gray industrial stuff downstairs, and the air smelled something between expensive cologne and recycled climate control. The receptionist at the front desk looked up with the polished, slightly wary expression of someone whose entire job was to manage access. "Can I help you?" "I just need 1 minute," Ethan said. "Do you have an appointment?" She reached for her phone. "Sir, Ms. Rowan has a full I'm not asking for a meeting. Ethan shifted the box slightly. I'm just going to leave something. I won't be long. The receptionist hesitated. Ethan had one of those faces that was hard to argue with, not aggressive, not threatening, just steady. The kind of face that said, I'm going to do this without any drama attached to it. She sat back slightly. The assistant's desk is right through. Thank you, Ethan said, and he walked past her before she could finish the sentence. Celeste Rowan's office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. On a clear morning, and it was a clear morning you could see straight across to the river, the water catching the early light, the bridges threading between the two banks like stitching on expensive fabric. Celeste wasn't at her desk. She was across the room at a standing table covered in architectural layouts and printed spreadsheets, talking quietly with two men in dark suits. She glanced up when Ethan appeared in the doorway. For a second, nobody said anything. Ethan recognized that second. It was the moment when a powerful person decided whether an intrusion was a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be removed. He watched her make the calculation, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening at the corner of her mouth. "Can I help you?" she said. The words were identical to what the receptionist had said. The tone was completely different. "My name is Ethan Mercer," he said. "I worked in operational logistics on the 3rd floor. I received my termination notice this morning." One of the men in suits shifted his weight. Celeste's expression didn't change. She said, "She sent it the way people mean something when they've said it so many times it has stopped costing them anything to say. HR should have all the necessary information." "I'm not here about HR," Ethan said. Something in her face shifted slightly. Just slightly. "I'm not here to argue," he continued. "I understand the restructuring. I understand the numbers." He paused. "I just wanted you to know that there's a person standing inside the position you eliminated." He reached into his cardboard box. He set the photograph on the corner of her desk. It was a simple photo, him and his daughter, Maisie, outside the aquarium 2 summers ago. Maisie was 8 now, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a stuffed dolphin she'd refused to put down for 3 days. Ethan had one arm around her and was laughing at something off camera. He looked younger in the photo than he felt now. He looked like a man who didn't yet know what the next 2 years were going to cost him. On the back of the photograph, Maisie had written something in the careful, uneven letters of a child who was still learning how to hold a pencil steady. "My dad always fixes things." Below her daughter's words, Ethan had written 9 of his own. "Before you erase a position, remember, there's a person standing inside it." He didn't explain it. He didn't wait for her response. He picked up his cardboard box, turned around, and walked out of Celeste Rowan's office. Behind him, the 2 men in suits looked at each other. They looked at Celeste. She was looking at the photograph. The drive home took 40 minutes longer than it should have, because Ethan took a wrong turn somewhere near the intersection of 5th and Callaway and didn't notice for 6 blocks because he was thinking about Maisie, about the mortgage, not about the health insurance that would stop at the end of the month, about the savings account that had exactly $2,312 in it, which he'd calculated last week would cover about 6 weeks of expenses if he was extremely careful and prayed nothing broke. He was thinking about Maisie. She'd be at school right now. She'd be at school right now in her 3rd grade classroom with the construction paper decorations on the wall and the desk she'd decorated with little dinosaur stickers that the teacher had eventually given up trying to make her remove. She'd be chewing the end of her pencil, a habit Ethan had tried to break for 2 years, and probably drawing something in the margin of her math worksheet because the arithmetic was too slow for the speed at which her brain moved. She had her mother's brain. Her mother's eyes, too, that particular shade of brown that shifted almost amber in strong light. Ethan pressed his palm flat against the steering wheel and exhaled slowly. He didn't let himself think about Claire too long. That particular wound was 3 years old and still hadn't fully closed. He didn't expect it would. Some things don't close, you just learn to build your life in a way that accounts for the opening. He'd built his life around Maisie, which meant that the stack of bills sitting on his kitchen counter, the water bill, car payment 2 weeks overdue, the electric bill that had been giving him chest pain since he'd opened it, those weren't just numbers. They were the scaffolding holding Maisie's world together. He pulled into the driveway of the small tan house on Marjorie Street and sat in the car for a while with the engine off. The house needed guttering work. He'd been putting it off since spring. The second porch step was starting to split. He'd been meaning to replace the board for 6 weeks and kept running out of weekend time. The flower bed along the front walk was overgrown because Maisie had decided in April that she wanted to grow sunflowers from seed and had planted in approximately 40 of them in a space designed for maybe 12, and Ethan hadn't had the heart to thin them out. 40 sunflowers, still green, still trying. He got out of the car, carried his cardboard box up the porch steps carefully, on account of the second one, and unlocked the front door. Inside, the house smelled like the dryer sheet he'd used that morning, and the faint trace of the peanut butter toast Maisie had eaten for breakfast. Ethan set the box down on the kitchen table, sat down in the chair nearest the window, and looked at the counter. The bills were still there. Of course they were. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and looked at it for a moment without unlocking it. He put it face down on the table, got up, filled a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen sink drinking it slowly while he looked out at the backyard. There was a rusted swing set out there that he'd been meaning to replace. Maisie said she was too old for it now anyway. She was 8. She'd been saying she was too old for things since she was 5. Too old for the swing set. Too old for the nightlight. Too old for the stuffed animals, except the dolphin from the aquarium, which apparently didn't count. The glass of water was empty. He hadn't noticed drinking it. He put it in the sink and went to the refrigerator to figure out what they were having for dinner. Maisie called at 3:47 right after the school bus dropped her at the corner. No, but yeah, Bug, I'm home. A pause. She could hear something in his voice she always could, Tecket. She had this radar for him that still caught him off guard sometimes. She'd had it even as a toddler, this fine-tuned sensitivity to his emotional frequency. How come you're home early? Took the afternoon off, he said. How come? Just felt like it. Another pause. He could hear her footsteps on the sidewalk, the small thump of her backpack shifting on her shoulders. Did something happen? She asked. Nothing you need to worry about, Ethan said. And he kept his voice level and easy the way he'd learned to. The way you learn when you're the only adult in the house and there's nobody else to absorb the weight before it reaches your kid. Maisie said, not quite believing him but deciding for now to let it go. Can we have pancakes for dinner? We just had pancakes 2 nights ago. I want them again. He smiled. He couldn't help it. We can have pancakes. With chocolate chips? We're out of chocolate chips. With blueberries? We might be out of those too. With nothing? With butter and syrup like regular humans. Fine, she said, with the particular theatrical suffering of an 8-year-old who has been denied chocolate chips. I'll be home in like 5 minutes. She hung up. Ethan stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the phone still in his hand. Then he went to the cabinet and got out the flour. Maisie made the pancakes herself mostly. Yet she'd been on a cooking phase since January. She'd watched approximately 400 episodes of some children's cooking show and had decided she was going to be a chef or possibly a marine biologist, possibly both simultaneously because she hadn't yet encountered an adult who told her that was unreasonable. Ethan had not been that adult. You have to let the bubbles form before you flip, she said very seriously. Standing on the step stool, she still needed to reach the stove. If you flip too early, they go flat. Okay, Ethan said. I'm telling you because last time you flipped too early. Yes, that's why they were a little flat. I thought they were pretty good. They were okay, she said, with the diplomatic generosity of someone who had decided to forgive a flipping error. But these ones are going to be better. They were burned around the edges. Badly, just the outer rim, slightly dark, the way pancakes go when you get distracted mid-cook. Maisie had gotten distracted by a story she was telling about a girl in her class named Ruby who had brought a live caterpillar to school in a jar, and the caterpillar had escaped during reading group. Did they find it? Ethan asked. Eventually, Maisie said. It was on Mrs. Patterson's shoe for like 20 minutes, and nobody told her. Ethan laughed. A real one. The kind that surprised him. Mrs. Patterson must have loved that. She was pretty upset, Maisie said solemnly. She made an announcement. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the two of them, with their slightly burned pancakes and a bottle of syrup that was 3/4 empty. Maisie ate 4 of them in the time it took Ethan to eat 2. She talked the entire time about the caterpillar, about a project on ecosystems, about how Ruby had cried when the caterpillar was found because she thought it was gone forever, about how Maisie had told her caterpillars don't even really run that fast, so it was probably never in much danger. "It was nice of you," Ethan said. "It was true," Maisie said, practical as always. "Can be both." She considered this, I guess. Ethan ate every bite of his pancakes, every burned edge. He ate them and smiled and said they were delicious. Because they were, in the way that food is delicious, when the person who made it is sitting across from you with syrup on their chin and is too busy talking about caterpillars to notice. Maisie fell asleep at 9:15. She'd been fighting it since 8:30, claiming she wasn't tired despite yawning every 45 seconds. But somewhere in the middle of the second chapter of the book they were reading together is a story about a girl who discovered a door in her grandmother's basement that leads to a city underneath the ocean. Her breathing had shifted and her body had gone heavy, the way it always did when she finally surrendered to sleep. Ethan marked the page carefully, set the book on her nightstand, and sat beside her for a moment in the dim room. She slept with one arm thrown over her head and her mouth slightly open, the stuffed dolphin tucked under her other arm. She'd outgrown the nightlight, but she still liked. The door cracked a few inches. She'd outgrown a lot of things. She was growing out of things constantly, faster than Ethan could track. He watched her sleep for a while. Then he went back to the kitchen. He cleaned up the dinner dishes. He wiped down the counter. He put the syrup back in the cabinet and washed the mixing bowl and hung the dish towel on the oven handle the way Claire used to always tell him to stop doing because it made the kitchen look messy. He sat down at the table. He pulled the stack of bills toward him. He went through them one by one. The water bill, the car payment, the electric bill that had been giving him chest pain, the credit card statement that he'd been paying the minimum on for 4 months, while he told himself he'd pay it down when things eased up, which they hadn't. A notice from the school about an upcoming field trip to the Science Museum, $22, due by Friday. He got out a pen and a piece of paper and started writing numbers. He sat at that table for a long time in the quiet house, in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of burned pancake edges and syrup, and he did the math that he'd been avoiding doing, and the numbers did what numbers do when you have too many expenses and too little income coming in. They didn't add up. He put the pen down. He sat very still for a moment, with his hands flat on the table, and his eyes fixed on the wall above the sink, where a small water stain had been spreading slowly for 2 months that he hadn't had the time or money to address yet. And then something happened that Ethan Mercer hadn't let happen in a very long time. Not loud, not dramatic, not the kind. A breaking that involves overturned furniture or shouted words or anything that would travel down the hall to Maisie's room. Nothing like that. Just a slow, silent collapse, his shoulders rounding forward, his head dropping, his hands coming up to cover his face, and the kind of crying that happens when a person has been holding something so heavy for so long that their arms simply give out. He cried for Claire, who had been gone 3 years, and whose absence was still a gravity that pulled at everything. He cried for the job he'd given 8 years to, gone in 15 minutes and a cardboard box. He cried for Maisie, who deserved so much more than a father sitting at a kitchen table at 10:30 at night, unable to figure out how to keep the lights on. He cried for all of it quietly, into his own hands, in the kitchen of the small tan house on Marjorie Street, while his daughter slept down the hall with her dolphin in her cracked door, completely unaware that her father, who always fixed things, was sitting alone in the dark and had no idea how to fix this. It lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then he wiped his face. He straightened up. He got up and poured himself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink, looking out at the dark backyard where the rusted swing set stood silver in the moonlight. He put the glass in the sink. He went back to the table, picked up the pen, and started writing numbers again, because the math still needed to be done. Because tomorrow morning, Maisie would wake up and she would need breakfast, and she would tell him something about caterpillars or marine biology, or both, and she would carry that dolphin down the hall and ask him something completely unexpected, and laugh at something he said, and the whole ordinary, necessary, irreplaceable machinery of their life together would start up again. Ethan Mercer was going to be there for it. He didn't know yet how he was going to manage the electric bill or the car payment or the $22 for the Science Museum by Friday. But he was going to be there. That much he knew how to fix. The 14th floor of Northvale Dynamics, the lights in Celeste Rowan's office, burned late into the night the way they usually did, the way they had every night for 4 years, because Celeste Rowan did not leave work until work was finished, and work was never quite finished. She sat behind her desk with her laptop open, and 3 reports spread out in front of her, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and that she hadn't noticed. The photograph was on the corner of her desk. She'd moved it twice. Once to set aside, once to move it back. It kept pulling her eyes. A little girl's face. A man laughing at something off camera. The uneven, careful handwriting of a child, still learning how to grip a pencil. My dad always fixes things. And beneath it, in the clean, measured hand of a man who was choosing his words very carefully, before you erase a position, remember, there's a person standing inside it. Celeste Rowan had fired 412 people in the last quarter. She'd done it with the steady, unemotional precision of someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury that companies in financial distress could not afford. She had spreadsheets, she had analysis, she had restructuring consultants and projection models, and 3 board members who had been breathing down her neck for 6 months, demanding that she cut costs or face a confidence vote. She had not cried. She had not lost sleep. She had not second-guessed. She was good at her job because she didn't let any of that in. She looked at the photograph. She pulled her laptop closer and typed a name into the search bar of the company's internal HR system. Ethan Mercer. Employee ID 4471 LG. Department Operational Logistics. Years of service 8. She opened the file. She started to read. And somewhere around the 3rd page, the coffee going cold and the reports forgotten, Celeste Rowan's face changed. Dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies, where the powerful character has a sudden revelation and everything shifts at once. It was smaller than that. Quieter. A slight tightening at the eyes. A stillness that was different from her usual stillness. The kind of change that happens when a person encounters something they didn't expect and realizes, very slowly, that they may have made a mistake. She read the entire file. She pulled up the department productivity records for the last 8 years. She read those too. When she finally looked up from her screen, the office outside her window was dark. The financial district had gone quiet. The river was black and silver in the distance. The bridges lit against the sky. Celeste Rowan sat alone in her 14th floor office, with a cold cup of coffee and a photograph on the corner of her desk, and she did something she had not done in a very long time. She sat still, and she thought about something other than numbers. The photograph looked back at her. My dad always fixes things. Celeste closed her laptop. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She picked up the photograph instead, holding it carefully by the edges the way you hold something you've realized, only just now, that you should have been handling more carefully all along. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it back down on the corner of her desk, not to the side this time, not tucked away, right where she could see it. And she sat there in the quiet office, in the building she owned, in the company she ran, with the cold coffee and the forgotten reports, and the river going silver black beyond the windows. And for the first time in a very long time, Celeste Rowan could not quite bring herself to turn the page and move on to the next problem. The file on Ethan Mercer was 43 pages long. Celeste didn't find that out until the following morning, when she pulled it up again on her laptop with fresh coffee, hot this time, and realized she'd only made it through about half it the night before. She'd gone home somewhere around midnight, not because she'd finished, but because her eyes had started to blur. And she'd made a rule for herself years ago about reading important documents when tired. You miss things when you're tired. You see what you expect to see rather than what's actually on the page. She hadn't expected 43 pages. Most employee files at Northvale ran 8 to 12. The file grew thicker with seniority, with performance reviews and department transfers, and any formal documentation complaints, filed commendations issued, requests submitted and approved or denied. A standard 8-year employee file might run 15 pages on the heavy end. 43 meant something had been happening in Ethan Mercer's tenure that generated a lot of paperwork. She'd assumed initially that it meant problems, disciplinary issues, the kind of accumulated friction that sometimes built up around employees who were difficult, who pushed back against management, who created the quiet, grinding conflict that HR had to document carefully in case it ever went legal. She was wrong about that. There wasn't a single disciplinary notation in the entire file. 1. What there was, spread across 43 pages in the dry procedural language of corporate record-keeping, was the portrait of a man who had spent 8 years being systematically underestimated. Celeste read it all this time. She read the performance review's first 11 of them, one for each review cycle during his tenure, written by 3 different managers over the years. The language was consistent in a way that started to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Meets expectations, reliable, good team player, no major concerns. Standard language. The kind of language that kept someone exactly where they were, that didn't flag them for promotion or flag them for termination, that essentially said this person exists and nothing more. But the actual content within those reviews, the specific incidents documented, the projects mentioned in passing, told a different story than the summary ratings. In his 3rd year, Ethan had identified a routing inefficiency in their supply chain that was costing the department approximately 4 to 6 hours staff time per week across 3 teams. He'd designed a new process, tested it quietly using his own time, documented it, and presented it to his manager. The manager had implemented it. The manager had also presented it upward as a departmental improvement without attributing it to Ethan. The review that year noted only that Ethan had been helpful in the transition to new processes. In his 5th year, a vendor contract had gone sideways. The vendor had been double billing for 6 months, a discrepancy buried in a line item format that most people in logistics wouldn't have caught without running a specific kind of cross-reference audit. Ethan caught it. He documented it carefully, brought it to his manager with supporting evidence, and then vacated the company over $90,000. The recovery was credited to the department in the quarterly report. Ethan's review that year mentioned that he demonstrates attention to detail. There were other things, smaller things, a safety issue he'd flagged before it became an incident, a staffing gap he'd quietly filled on his own time during a department crunch without being asked, a training process he'd developed for new operational staff that 3 different managers had adopted without ever formalizing his authorship. 8 years, one after another, and every single time the credit had drifted upward, and the man who'd generated it had stayed exactly where he was. Celeste set her coffee down and sat back in her chair. She'd built her career on the belief that companies were, at their core, rational systems, that value was recognized and rewarded, because it was in the company's interest to recognize and reward it. She'd believed that because it was mostly true at the executive level, where performance was visible and compensation was tied directly to outcomes that the board could measure. She hadn't thought very carefully about what happened 4 floors below the executive level. She pulled up the operational productivity data for Ethan's going back 8 years. It took her 20 minutes to find the right reports and cross-reference them properly. She was not a woman who gave up when something required 20 minutes. The data was clear. She could see his fingerprints all over it, not because anyone had labeled them as his, but because she knew what to look for now. The efficiency gains, the cost reductions, the small, consistent improvements that didn't make anyone's headline but quietly added up to a number she finally calculated herself, going back through 5 years of recoverable data. The number was significant, not enormous, not in the context of a company North Vale's size, but significant. She sat with that number for a moment. He'd indeed. Then she turned to page 31 of his file, where she found something she hadn't expected. A request form. Submitted 14 months ago, before Ethan had any reason to suspect the company was heading toward a restructuring. A formal request for a modified schedule, not reduced hours, not a pay adjustment, just a shift in his daily schedule that would have allowed him to drop Maisie at school in the morning and be available for pickup 2 afternoons a week when there was no aftercare available. The form had been denied. The denial was 1 line, signed by a manager named Derek Paulson. Operational needs require standard scheduling for all department staff. Beneath it, In the space the form provided for employee response, Ethan had written, "Understood. I'll make other arrangements." That was it. No argument. Escalation. No formal complaint filed. He'd written, "I'll make other arrangements," and gone back to work. Celeste stared at that line for longer than she'd stared at anything else in the file. She'd thought about what making other arrangements looked like for a man in Ethan's position. Calling in favors, it meant paying someone to cover pickup. Money he didn't have to spare. It meant a child dropped at a neighbor's house, or sitting in an aftercare program she hadn't needed to be in. Or a father trying to compress the of an unreachable daughter into the margins of a workday that someone else had designed without him in mind at all. She picked up her phone and called her executive assistant. "Get me Derek Paulson's file," she said, "and pull the complete restructuring termination list. I want every file flagged for review by end of day." Was a brief pause on the other end. "All 412? "All 412, Celeste said. She hung up and looked at the photograph. It was still there on the corner of her desk, exactly where she'd left it the night before. The news about Northvale's restructuring had gotten around, the way these things do, through industry channels and LinkedIn posts and the particular informal network of people who worked in finance and operations, and made it their business to know when a company of Northvale's size started shedding people. A few journalists had called. Celeste had issued a standard statement about strategic realignment and positioning for future growth, and the journalists had printed it without much comment because it was exactly the kind of statement that companies always issued, and that meant nothing specific. What hadn't gotten around was what Celeste was doing now. She spent the morning in her office reading files. Not all 412, she wasn't capable of miracles, and she understood her own limits, but a representative C sample, pulled by her assistant, according to criteria Celeste specified: length of tenure, department, performance rating, flagging family or personal circumstances in the file. The sample was 30 files. She read all 30. By 11 o'clock, something had settled in her chest that wasn't quite guilt. Celeste wasn't built for simple guilt, but was something adjacent to it. A recognition that sat uncomfortably. The sensation of seeing something you should have seen earlier, and knowing exactly why you hadn't. She called Marcus Webb into her office. Marcus was her chief of operations, 47 years old, 18 years at Northvale, the kind of institutional knowledge that you couldn't replace with a hire. He was also one of 3 people in the building who would tell Celeste things she didn't want to hear, which was the main reason she kept him close. "Sit down," she said when he came in. He sat. He looked at the files spread across her desk, and his expression shifted slightly, the way it did when he was calculating something. "What are we doing? I'm going to ask you something, and I want a straight answer." "'Kay, did you know about the Mercer situation?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone caught. Marcus wasn't like that, but the quiet of someone choosing how to frame something accurately. "I knew the name when I saw it on the list. I flagged it internally." "You flagged it? To Paulson? And Paulson said?" "Paulson said the position was redundant based on the restructuring model." Marcus paused. I pushed back. He said the model was final. Celeste looked at him. "You didn't bring it to me." "Why not?" Marcus held her gaze. "Because the message from leadership was that we were not revisiting individual termination decisions, that the model was final, and exceptions would undermine the entire restructuring." He paused. "That message came from your office." Celeste didn't say anything. "I'm not saying that to pass it off," Marcus said. "I'm saying it because it's true. The system we built for this restructuring wasn't designed to catch what Mercer represented. It was designed to be fast and clean and legally defensible." He looked at the files on her desk. "Fast and clean doesn't always mean right." "No," Celeste said. "It doesn't." She looked out the window for a moment. Across the district, the morning had turned gray, clouds moving in from the west. "How many of the 412 do you think fall into the same category?" she asked. Marcus considered it. He was the kind of man who didn't give numbers he couldn't back up. 50, maybe 60. People whose value didn't translate cleanly onto the model because the model was measuring the wrong things. He shifted in his chair. "Some of them have probably already found other positions. Some haven't. I want a proper review," Celeste said. "Every termination. I want people with actual operational knowledge doing the review, not just HR running numbers. Marcus looked at her for a moment. That's going to be expensive, time-wise and financially, if we end up reversing decisions. The board is not going to love it. I know that, too. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll put together a process. And Marcus, she stopped him as he started to stand. Find out where Mercer is. Whether he's taken another position. Marcus looked at her steadily. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we made a mistake, Celeste said. And I'm thinking there might be a way to correct it. Ethan had been out of work for 11 days when Celeste's assistant called. He was in the middle of a job application, his fourth that week. The fourth that he'd stared at for 20 minutes before starting. Because there is a specific humiliation in having to compress 8 years of invisible work into a 8-page document and hope that someone who has never met you decides you're worth a conversation. He'd gotten one callback so far, from a logistics company across town that paid 40% less than he'd been making at Northvale, which math he'd been trying to make work in his head for 3 days without success. His phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He'd been fielding calls from creditors, not aggressively yet, but the early warning kind, the courteous reminder calls that were still polite because they hadn't yet concluded he was a lost cause. He'd gotten good at identifying the pattern. But something made him pick up. Mr. Mercer? A woman's voice, professional, pleasant. This is Diana, calling from Northvale Dynamics.
Miss
Rowan's executive assistant. She's asked me to reach out to see if you might be available for a conversation. Ethan sat very still. What kind of conversation, he said. Miss Rowan would like to speak with you personally. At your convenience. A brief pause. She asked me to tell you, and I'm quoting directly, that it's not about HR. He recognized the phrase. He'd said it himself, standing in her doorway with a cardboard box. He said, she's available this week. Tomorrow, if that works for you. Ethan looked at the job application open on his laptop. The blank fields waiting to be filled. The question asking him to describe his most significant professional achievement in 200 words or fewer. What time, he said. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and running through scenarios in his head, the way you do when you're trying to prepare for something you don't fully understand. He wasn't sure what she wanted. He wasn't sure what he wanted, which was the more complicated part. He wasn't angry. That surprised him a little, that there wasn't more anger. He was tired. He was worried. He was a man with an electric bill and a car payment and a daughter who needed new shoes because she'd grown a full size since spring. He was not, however, angry at Celeste Rowan specifically. He'd left the photograph because he'd wanted her to see something, to punish her, not to make her feel bad, just because something in him had needed, at the end of those 8 years, to be seen by the person who had made the decision. Whether she'd actually looked, whether it had landed, or simply been swept off her desk by a passing assistant he hadn't known. He hadn't let himself think too much about it. Now, apparently, she'd looked. He turned over and stared at the wall. Down the hall, he could hear Maisie's faint, steady breathing. She slept deeply, always had from infancy on. Claire had said it meant she had a clear conscience. Ethan had said it meant she tired herself out completely every single day, which was equally true. He thought about what he was going to say. He thought about it for a long time, until the room was quiet, and the streetlight outside the window made a pale rectangle on the ceiling, and his eyes finally got heavy enough. He fell asleep, still thinking about it. He wore the same clothes he'd worn to his first interview at Northvale. He didn't decide this consciously. He was standing in front of his closet at 7:30 in the morning, Maisie eating cereal at the kitchen table and talking about something at school involving a science fair, and his hand just reached for the dark blue jacket without deliberate thought. He noticed it afterward and almost changed. Then he didn't. He dropped Maisie at school. She was distracted. She was always distracted in the morning, her mind already 6 steps ahead in her school day. But at the car door, she stopped and looked at him with that particular focused attention she got, sometimes, the look that still knocked him sideways because it was so precisely Claire's. "Where are you going?" she asked. "A meeting." "What kind of meeting?" "The regular kind." She looked at his jacket. She looked at his face. She was 8, and she was not fooled. "Good luck," she said. He kissed the top of her head. "Get in there." she went. Receptionist on the 14th floor was a different one, this time. Or maybe the same one who had rearranged her expression. She was expecting him. Diana had called ahead, and she walked him back to the executive suite without asking for his name. Celeste was at her desk, not at the standing table with the architectural layouts, at her actual desk, which Ethan realized he'd never seen her at before. She stood when he came in, which surprised him. He hadn't expected her to stand. She looked different from his memory of her. He'd built her up into something slightly larger than life in the 11 days since he'd seen her, the way you do with powerful people when you have time to think about them in the abstract. She was 30 years old, and she was exactly 30 years old. There was a quality to her that was both older and younger than her age somehow, a tension between the certainty she carried in her posture and something less certain around the edges. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "thank you for coming, Miss." She gestured to the chairs in front of her desk, not the chairs at the standing table, the meeting chairs. These were regular chairs. "Please." They sat. On the corner of her desk, he'd left it 11 days ago. The photograph was still there. He noticed it immediately. He didn't say anything about it. "I've been reading your file," Celeste said. She said it directly, without preamble, which he found he appreciated. The complete file, 8 years. "Okay," Ethan said. "I want to ask you some questions, if that's all right." HR questions. She stopped. Started again. "I read about the billing discrepancy in year 5. The vendor double billing. The Hendricks contract. You recovered $90,000 for this company." "Closer to 94, he said. "But yes. Your review that year said you demonstrate attention to detail." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember reading that." Celeste's jaw moved slightly. Not quite a wince. "The routing process you redesigned in year 3. Your manager implemented it and presented it to leadership as a departmental initiative." "It was a departmental initiative," Ethan said carefully. "I was in the department. He didn't credit you. Did you say anything?" "No." "Why not?" Ethan looked at her. "Because it wasn't worth it." She frowned. "What do you mean it wasn't worth it?" "I mean that I would have spent political capital I didn't have in a department run by a manager who didn't like being corrected, to get my name attached to something that the people above him would have forgotten in a month anyway." He paused. The process worked. That was the point of it. Celeste was quiet, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. "That's a very measured response," she said. "I've had time to think about it." 11 days. 8 years, he said. 11 days to not talk about it to anyone. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, just a small change in pressure. The way a conversation sometimes pivots when both people in it decide to stop being careful. "I want to offer you your job back," Celeste said. Ethan said. She blinked. He thought she might be the kind of person who didn't get surprised very often, and therefore didn't have a well-rehearsed face for it. "I assumed that's what this was." She leaned back slightly. "And?" Ethan looked at the photograph on the corner of her desk. He looked at it for a moment, then back at her. "I need to think about it. I'm not just offering you the same position," she said. She'd intervened. She'd prepared for pushback. He could tell she'd thought through what she was going to say and had arrived at this meeting with something more substantial than a salary reinstatement. "I want to talk about something bigger. A new role. Something that didn't exist before. Tell me what you're thinking," she told him. She talked for about 15 minutes. About the review process, she'd initiated all 412 terminations being re-examined by people with actual operational knowledge. What she'd found in his file and in others. About the gap between what the restructuring model measured and what it had missed. About a division she was considering, one that would combine operational improvement with something the company had never had. A formal internal structure for supporting employees, navigating family emergencies, flexible scheduling, the kind of crises that didn't show up on productivity reports until it was too late. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt, which was a quality she seemed to notice. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How many of the 412 are you actually going to bring back?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I don't know yet. The review takes time. But some. Yes. Some. And the ones you can't bring back, the ones who've already taken other jobs, or who the new structure genuinely doesn't have a place for." Celeste was quiet for a beat. We're working on a support package, more substantial than the standard severance. Transition assistance, references, priority consideration for future openings. That's different from a job, Ethan said. I know. I'm not saying it's nothing. I'm saying it's different from a job. She looked at him steadily. Yes, it is. He nodded slowly. He picked up the edge of his jacket slightly and then let it fall, a small, unconscious gesture of a man who was thinking hard about something and trying not to show exactly how hard. I appreciate what you're putting together, he said, and I can see that you're... He stopped, chose the word carefully, that you're doing this for the right reasons, or trying to. But, she said, but restoring my job doesn't fix what happened to me. And creating a new program doesn't automatically fix what the culture of this company does to people who carry things that don't show up on the efficiency model. He paused. I need to know that this is a real change, not a PR response. Something that runs for 6 months and gets quietly defunded when the next board pressure hits. Celeste didn't look away. I understand that concern. Yes, she said it simply, without defense. And I can't prove it to you today. I can tell you it's real, but that's not proof. Proof takes time. She paused. What I can tell you is that the review is already in process. Marcus Webb is running it. He's going to take it seriously. Because Marcus always takes things seriously, and because I asked him to. Marcus Webb flagged my termination internally, and it didn't change anything, Ethan said. Celeste blinked again. You know that? Danny in accounting told me. We talked after I was let go. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her recalibrate. Marcus flagged it to Paulson. I know, Ethan said. I'm not blaming Marcus. He paused. I'm pointing out that there's a difference between flagging something and it being heard. The silence lasted several seconds. Outside, a phone rang somewhere down the hall and was answered quickly. I understand, Celeste said. That's a fair point. She looked at him directly, with the particular directness of someone who had decided to stop managing the conversation and just say the thing. I didn't hear it. I should have built a system where I would have heard it. I didn't. She paused. I'm asking you to help me build that system now. Ethan looked at her. There was something genuine in her face, not polished, not executive presentation genuine, but actually genuine, the kind that sits a little less comfortably because it hasn't been rehearsed into smoothness. He'd spent 8 years reading the faces of people in corporate spaces, and he'd gotten reasonably good at the difference. He looked at the photograph, Maisie's handwriting, the dolphin, his own laughing face from 2 summers ago. I need a couple of days, he said. Of course. And I have a question before I go. Ask it. What about everyone else you fired, he said. The question landed in the room and stayed there. Celeste looked at him. That's what the review is for. I know. He stood, picking up his jacket from the arm of the chair. I just needed to hear you say it. Not the process. The plan. I needed to hear that you understand. The question isn't really about me. He left her with that. No. He took the elevator, down to the lobby, walked through the glass doors, and stood on the sidewalk outside Northvale Dynamics for a moment in the gray morning air. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel relieved. He felt the specific, complicated weight of a situation that was moving in the right direction but hadn't arrived anywhere yet. He started walking toward where he'd parked the car. Yes. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Maisie, sent from school in violation of about 17 rules, because Maisie's relationship with phone policies was creative at best. How did the meeting go? He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk with the gray morning around him, and the city making its regular sounds, and typed back. Go put your phone away. 3 seconds. Was it the Northvale lady? He stared at the screen. How do you know about that? You had your first interview jacket on. He stood there for a moment. Despite everything, despite the electric bill and the car payment and the 43-page file and the unresolved weight of 2 days of thinking still ahead of him, he laughed. Loud. Just a quiet, helpless laugh into the gray morning air. Go to class, he typed. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood there another moment, looking up at the building he'd just come out of, 14 floors of glass and steel, and the photograph sitting on a desk on the top floor that he'd left as a goodbye, and that had somehow become something else entirely. Then he walked to his car. He had a decision to make, and 2 days to make it. Tonight, when Maisie got home, she was going to ask him about the meeting in that direct, laser-focused way she had, and he was going to have to figure out how much of the truth an 8-year-old needed and how much she was, in her particular way, already carrying with him. He drove home through the gray morning, taking the right turns this time, his hands steady on the wheel. The decision wasn't made yet, but something in him had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel the first movement of something heavy when you've been pushing against it for a long time and it finally begins, slowly, to give. The 2 days Ethan had asked for stretched into 3. He hadn't planned for 3. He'd told himself he would think it through carefully, sleep on it twice, and have an answer by Thursday morning. Thursday morning came, and he was still sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, which was becoming a recurring theme in his life: cold coffee and unanswered questions sitting side by side on the same surface. The logistics company across town had called back, the one that paid 40% less. They wanted a second interview, which meant they were serious, which meant Ethan now had an actual decision to make, rather than an abstract one. He'd scheduled the interview for Friday, something concrete to hold on to while he figured out what he actually wanted to do. What he actually wanted was a thing he hadn't let himself examine too carefully. He wanted to go back. Not to the same position that was done. He understood that clearly, and he wasn't nostalgic enough to pretend that returning to the 3rd floor, as though nothing had happened, would work for anyone. But the work itself, the operational work, the problem solving, the particular satisfaction of finding the inefficiency nobody else had noticed and quietly eliminating it. He was good at that work, in a way he wasn't sure he was good at anything else professionally, and 8 years of doing it had made him better in ways he couldn't fully quantify. The question wasn't whether he wanted to go back. The question was whether he trusted what Celeste Rowan was building. He went back and forth on it. He made a list, an actual paper list, which he would have been embarrassed to admit to anyone over the age of 12, with 2 columns, and filled it in, and then looked at it for a long time, and then folded it in half and put it in the kitchen drawer because making the list hadn't helped. What was stopping him wasn't distrust of Celeste exactly. It was something more complicated. It was the recognition that a person can mean something genuinely in a room and then walk out of that room and be moved by different pressures, board pressures, financial pressures, the accumulated institutional gravity of a company that had operated a certain way for a long time, and that meaning can erode without the person even noticing it's happening. He'd watched it happen to good managers, people who came into departments with genuine intentions and real energy, and within 18 months had been shaped by the machine around them into something that looked a lot like the people they'd replaced. He didn't think Celeste Rowan was weak. He didn't think she was dishonest. He thought she was 30 years old and running a billion-dollar company and operating under pressures he couldn't fully see, and he thought that the photograph on her desk had moved her, genuinely moved her. He believed that being moved and sustaining change were 2 entirely different things. He was thinking about all of this on the evening of the 3rd day, standing at the kitchen sink washing the dinner dishes while Maisie sat at the table behind him doing homework. When Maisie said, without looking up from her worksheet, "You should just go back," he turned around. She was drawing something in the margin of her math homework. A small fish, which was her default margin drawing since the aquarium visit. She said it without any particular weight, the way she said most things, as though the answer was obvious and she was mildly surprised it required discussion. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "Because you've been making your thinking face for 3 days, and you only make your thinking face when you already know what you want to do, but you're not sure if you're allowed to want it." He stared at her. She looked up. "Mrs. Patterson says overthinking is just a fancy word for being scared." "Mrs. Patterson said that?" "She said it about Ruby's science fair project, but I think it applies to you." Ethan turned back to the dishes. He stood there for a moment with the water running. "It's more complicated than just going back," he said. Maisie said, "You said that already. You said it when you thought I was asleep." She paused. "I wasn't asleep. I was just being quiet." He turned off the water. Yet he dried his hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. "You were listening to me think out loud?" "You were thinking out loud very loudly," she said without a trace of apology. She capped her marker. She'd been doing the math worksheet in marker, which was going to be a whole separate conversation, and looked at him. Did the lady say she was going to fix? A lot of things, Ethan said. If she actually does them. Did she seem like she was lying? He thought about Celeste's face across the desk, the way something less certain had been visible around the edges of her. He said, she didn't seem like she was lying. So maybe she's not, Maisie said, with the infuriating logical simplicity of a child who hadn't yet accumulated enough experience to know that things were rarely that clean. It's not that simple, he said. Dad. She looked at him with that particular look, the one he still wasn't fully ready for. You always say, people deserve a chance to fix things. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Go to bed, he said. It's only 8:15. Go start getting ready for bed. She gathered her worksheet marker fish in the margin and her markers and her backpack, and she shuffled down the hall. At the door she stopped and turned around. I think you should call her tomorrow, Maisie said. Good night, Maisie. I'm just saying. Good night. She went. Ethan stood in the kitchen alone and looked at the oven handle where the dish towel was hanging. He thought about what she'd said for a long time. He didn't call Celeste the next morning. Instead, something happened that neither of them had planned. Celeste came to him. He found out later, from Marcus, that she'd driven to Marjorie Street herself, not with a driver, not with her assistant or a security detail, just in her own car, which Marcus had described as extremely out of character, in the flat tone of a man who had worked with her long enough to know exactly how far outside her normal operating range it was. She'd gotten the address from HR. She hadn't told anyone she was going until she was already in the car. What she told Marcus later was that she'd been sitting in her office at 7 in the morning looking at the photograph. Yeah. And she'd had the sudden uncomfortable conviction that another phone call was the wrong approach. That another meeting in another boardroom or executive office was the wrong environment. That she had spent her entire career conducting important conversations on her own ground, in rooms she owned, across tables that were an implicit reminder of where the power in the conversation sat. She wanted to see where Ethan Mercer actually lived. She wasn't fully sure why, and that uncertainty was itself unusual enough that she'd decided to follow it. She found Marjorie Street at 8:40 in the morning, parked across from the small tan house with the overgrown front garden, and sat in her car for a moment. The house was exactly what she'd imagined, and nothing like what she'd expected. She'd formed an image of Ethan Mercer from his file, and from the 2 times she'd spoken to him a precise, composed image, a man of quiet competence and measured words. The house confirmed some of that. It was orderly in its way, despite the overgrown garden, despite the guttering that needed attention, despite the porch step that clearly wasn't structurally sound. Was the house of a person who was doing the best they could with what they had and who hadn't yet found the margin to do better. She got out of the car. She crossed the street and was halfway up the front walk when she heard them through the open kitchen window, not clearly, not every word, but the shape of it. A man's voice, patient and slightly tired, and a child's voice, confident and quick, talking over the sound of something being poured, cereal or juice, the ordinary percussion of a weekday morning. She stopped. Through the kitchen window, partially visible between the curtain edge and the frame, she could see Ethan at the kitchen table. The kitchen table. She'd been imagining some abstract piece of furniture in an abstract house, but the actual table, with actual things on it, a coffee mug, a folded newspaper, a homework worksheet covered in what appeared to be marker drawings, a water glass with a small chip in the rim. And Maisie, she was in her school uniform, a dark green sweater over a white shirt, her hair in 2 uneven braids that suggested she'd done them herself, and she was holding something in both hands, examining it with the focused intensity of a child who has found something interesting. A small plastic model of an airplane with a broken wing, one side hanging at an angle from a snapped connector. The pin's broken, Maisie said. See, I see, Ethan said. Can you fix it? Probably. I need the right piece. There's a hobby shop on Clement Street that might have it. When can we go? Saturday, maybe, if the weather's okay. Maisie turned the plane over in her hands. What if we can't find the piece? We make do with something else, Ethan said. He was looking at the plane, but not really looking at it. He had the expression of a man whose mind was partly somewhere else, but who was keeping his attention anchored in the room by discipline. Sometimes when the original part isn't available, you have to find a different solution. doesn't mean the plane stays broken. Maisie considered this seriously. "Kay," she said. She set the plane carefully in the middle of the table. "Promise?" "Yeah," Ethan said. Celeste stood on the front walk of the small tan house, with the overgrown sunflowers pressing against her legs and the sound of the morning through the open window, and something happened in her chest that she didn't have a good word for. It wasn't guilt, though there was guilt somewhere in it. It wasn't pity, because what she was seeing wasn't pitiable, it was just real. Just the specific ordinary weight of a real life. A man and his daughter, and a broken model airplane on a kitchen table, yet the simple machinery of someone else's world running without her, without any input from her at all, because the world didn't stop for a restructuring spreadsheet. My dad always fixes things. She understood what Maisie had meant now, and it was not what she'd assumed when she'd first read the words. She'd read it as a child's admiration, the natural inflation that children apply to the people they love most. But standing outside this house, having just heard Ethan say, "We make do with something else," doesn't mean the plane stays broken. She heard something more specific in it. She rang the bell. Ethan answered the door in a gray sweatshirt and the expression of a man who had not been expecting company. He saw her, and his face went through several things in the space of about 2 seconds. Surprise first, genuine, unguarded, then something more careful coming down over it, the composure he was good at, the steadiness. Then something complicated underneath that she couldn't fully read. "Miss Rowan," he said. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have called first. I realize this is—" She stopped. She'd had a version of this entrance in her head that had been more dignified than this. "I wanted to see you outside of Northvale. I thought it might be easier to talk." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed the door open a little wider. "Come in," he said. The kitchen still smelled like coffee and the morning. Yes, he'd Maisie was no longer at the table. She'd heard the bell and disappeared down the hall with her backpack in the way children do when they're trying to look like they aren't listening, but are absolutely listening. The broken model airplane was still in the middle of the table. Yes, Celeste sat in the chair Ethan indicated. He got 2 mugs from the cabinet, poured coffee without asking whether she wanted any, and set one in front of her. She noticed the chip on the rim of her mug. She noticed that it matched the chip on the water glass she'd seen through the window. "I haven't made my decision yet," Ethan said. He sat across from her and wrapped both hands around his own mug. "That's not entirely why I came." She paused. She looked at the table, at the airplane. "How old is she?" 8. "She looks like you." "She looks like her mother," he said. He said it without self-pity, just flatly and honestly. Celeste nodded. She looked at her coffee. "I read the file on Derek Paulson." Ethan was quiet. "Your schedule requests the modified hours for Maisie's school pickups." He denied it in 40 minutes. He didn't bring it to his supervisor. He didn't explore alternatives. He denied it and marked your case closed in under an hour. She paused. He did the same to 4 other employees in your department over an 18-month period. All of them had family-related requests. All denied. Escalated. "I know about the others," Ethan said. "Not officially, but people talk." He looked at her. "We all knew that submitting anything family-related to Paulson was essentially throwing it in the trash. So most people stopped submitting. Why didn't anyone report it?" He said aggressively. "Just a genuine question." She opened her mouth and stopped. Because the answer to HR, to management, through the formal channels, was exactly the kind of answer that sounded reasonable from 14 floors up and completely disconnected from reality. At the ground level, where people worked for managers who controlled their schedules and their reviews and their future at the company. "Right," she said. "Paulson wasn't a monster," Ethan said. "He was just a manager who'd been told that efficiency was the metric and everything else was friction. He was following the incentives." He paused. "Your incentives. Or the company's. Same thing." Celeste looked at him. "You're not wrong," she said. "I know." She put her mug down. She sat with her hands flat on the table, which was not a posture she usually assumed in professional conversations. She was usually more contained than that, but something about the kitchen, about the chipped mug and the airplane, and the 43 pages she'd read, had made the careful positioning feel false. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Not as a pitch. Not to persuade you. I just want to say it." He waited. "I built this company's recovery strategy on a belief that I thought was rational," she said. The belief that human capital could be assessed with the right metrics. If you measured the right things accurately enough, you'd always identify the right people to keep. She paused. I built the restructuring model on that belief. 412 people went through it. And the model was measuring the wrong things. She said it flatly. The way you say "see" thing when you've spent several days arriving at it and have finally stopped softening it. It was measuring what was visible and attributable. Hours logged, outputs recorded, reports filed. It wasn't measuring what Paulson's department actually lost when you left. She paused. Because what you contributed wasn't any report. Never was, Ethan said. I know that now. You knew it before, he said. Unkindly. You just weren't looking. The kitchen was quiet. Down the hall, there was a small, unmistakable sound of floorboard, the specific creak of the third board from Maisie's room, which Ethan knew the sound of the way parents sound in a house where a child is technically in their room and definitely not eavesdropping. He looked at the hallway for a second. His expression shifted, softened, then steadied again. What does the new role actually look like? He asked. The concept, the day-to-day. She'd prepared for this. She'd stayed up until 1 a.m. 2 nights ago, putting together a document that wasn't a formal proposal. She'd been deliberately careful not to make it formal, not to make it look like a recruiting package. She understood instinctively that presenting Ethan Mercer with a recruiting package would be exactly the wrong move. It was a description. 4 pages, plain language, what the division would actually do, who it would report to, what authority it would carry, what resources she was willing to commit to it. She reached into her bag and slid it across the table. He picked it up. He read it. She drank her coffee and waited. She didn't talk while he read, which took willpower, because silence in professional settings made her want to fill it, and she'd learned a long time ago that the impulse to fill silence was almost always about her own discomfort rather than any genuine conversational need. She let it to be silent. He finished reading. He set the document down on the table with his hand resting on top of it, not pushing it back to her. You put him reporting to me, he said. The employee support coordinator. You put that position reporting to me, not to HR. Why? Because if it reports to HR, it becomes an HR function. Documentation and compliance. And if it becomes an HR function, managers will find ways to work around it the way they find ways to work around every HR function. She paused. If it reports to you, it has operational authority. It sits inside the part of the company that makes decisions about how work actually gets done. He was quiet, reading something on the page again. Open Door Fund, he said. Emergency financial assistance for employees facing sudden family or financial crises. Small grants, interest-free short-term loans. I've allocated an initial budget. She paused. I want a board of employees to administer it, not management. Decisions made by peers, not supervisors. He looked up. That's going to be a harder sell to the board than everything else. They're going to say it creates dependency. Entitlement. Some of them will. What are you going to say back? She met his eyes. I'm going to say that the alternative is watching experienced, valuable employees leave the company or fall apart inside the company because they hit a wall we could have helped them get over, and that the math on employee turnover and institutional knowledge loss makes the fund look like an extremely reasonable investment. And if they don't buy the math argument, then I'll push it through anyway, she said. I'm still the CEO. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more the movement something makes in a face before it decides whether to become a smile, but it was there. I have conditions, he said. Okay, not negotiating conditions, not trying to extract things. Just things that need to be true for this to work. The review process for the terminated employees. I want a real timeline, and I want to be in the room when the decisions are made, to override you. But as a check, someone who isn't invested in justifying the original decision. Done, she said. Paulson's management training gets redesigned. Just Paulson. All department managers. And it includes family obligation policy, not as a compliance checkbox, but as actual practice. Marcus is already working on it. I talked to Marcus directly about what that looks like. Before it's finalized, I'll set it up. He looked at the document again. The flexible scheduling policy, it can't have exceptions based on manager discretion. If it has exceptions, Paulson just becomes 1,000 different people, making 1,000 different exceptions, and nothing changes. The policy would need to be uniform, she agreed. Exceptions only through a formal review, above the manager level. Above the manager level, and documented, he said. Everything documented. Everything documented, she repeated. He picked up the document. He set it back down. He looked at her across the kitchen table of the small tan house on Marjorie Street, with the chipped mugs and the airplane with the broken wing and the sound of a small person being very still down the hall. The photograph, he said. She looked at him. You kept it on your desk, he said. She didn't deny it or explain it. Yes. Why? She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the mug in her hands. Because it kept asking me a question I didn't have a good answer to, she said. And I found that the things you can't answer are usually the things you need to keep looking at. He sat with that. She sat with it too. Outside, a car went by on Marjorie Street, then another. The morning was moving forward, the way mornings do, indifferent to decisions being made at kitchen tables. I need to get Maisie to school, Ethan said finally. Celeste looked at him. I'll give you my answer by tomorrow morning, he said. But I need to get her to school right now. Celeste nodded. She pushed her chair back and stood, picking up her bag. Ethan stood too. Maisie, he called down the hall. A pause. Then the sound of a door opening very quickly, as though it had been barely closed. Maisie appeared at the end of the hallway with her backpack, her uneven braids, her green sweater. She saw Celeste and went very still, the way children go still when they encounter an adult who doesn't fit into their usual categories. Maisie, this is Ms. Rowan, Ethan said. She works with Dad. Yes, he's... Maisie looked at Celeste with the direct, unfiltered assessment of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. Her eyes traveled from Celeste's face to her coat, to her shoes, expensive shoes, on the scuffed linoleum floor of the Mercer kitchen, and back up. You're the lady from the photo, Maisie said. I'm sorry, Celeste said. Dad showed me a picture of his office once. You were in it. On a poster or something. She tilted her head. You looked more serious in the poster. Maisie, Ethan said. I'm just saying she looks less serious in person, Maisie said, with the tone of someone offering a compliment that they don't understand has an edge. Something happened in Celeste's face that wasn't CEO Celeste, that was something more unguarded than that. She looked at the child standing in the hallway, holding her backpack straps, and regarding her with absolute directness. And Celeste said, I'll take that as a good sign. It is, Maisie said simply. Then to her father, I'm going to be late. Get your jacket. Maisie disappeared back down the hall. There was the sound of a closet, the sound of a zipper. Ethan walked Celeste to the front door. On the porch, she stopped and turned. Thank you, she said, for letting me come. You didn't really ask, he said. She said, I didn't. She paused. I'm working on that. He looked at her for a moment. Tomorrow morning, he said. You'll have my answer. She nodded. She walked down the porch, steps avoiding the second one. She noticed, from his instinctive gestures, as she went down, the slight reach of his hand that didn't quite connect, but was there and down the front walk, between the crowded sunflowers. At the sidewalk, she stopped and looked back. The house looked different from the street than it had when she'd arrived. Smaller or larger, just more itself, more specific. The kind of house that existed in a specific neighborhood, in a specific city, on a specific street, where a specific child ate pancakes and drew fish in the margins of math homework, and left the door cracked at night, and asked her father to fix broken things, because in her entire lived experience he always had. She got in her car. She sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Through the front window of the house, she could see movement in the hallway, the brief shapes of Ethan and Maisie moving through the house, the small figure bouncing slightly with backpack energy, the taller one moving steadily alongside. Then the front door opened, and they came out together, Maisie talking, Ethan listening, both of them heading toward the car in the driveway. Maisie glanced across at Celeste's car as they went. She raised one hand in a small wave, not self-conscious about it. Just a wave. The way you wave at someone who is there. Celeste raised her hand back. Maisie turned back to her father and said something that made him look briefly at the sky with the expression of a man requesting patience from the universe. Celeste started the car. She pulled out onto Marjorie Street and drove back toward the financial district. back wide the glass tower and the 14th floor, and the board and the meetings, and the spreadsheets, and the 412 files, waiting for review, and she drove the whole way, without her radio, on and without making a single phone call, which was so far outside her normal morning commute routine that her assistant, when she arrived, asked if everything was all right. Fine, she said. Push my 9 o'clock 15 minutes. Of course. Do you want your coffee before? She said. I'm fine for coffee. She went into her office and sat down and looked at the photograph on the corner of her desk. Maisie's face, Ethan's laugh, the stuffed dolphin, the writing on the back that she'd memorized, now without trying to. She thought about what he'd said. The things you can't answer are usually the things you need to keep looking at. She'd said that to him. But sitting here, she understood it had been true about her, long before she'd articulated it across a kitchen table. She had been not answering the question this photograph asked for 11 days. She was still not fully answering it. The question wasn't really about Ethan Mercer. She understood now. Ethan Mercer was the specific face on the specific version of a question that the 14th floor had never had to sit with before. The question was older and bigger than one man in one cardboard box. It was about whether a company, whether she could hold two things at once, the ruthless clarity required to keep an enterprise financially viable, and the basic human recognition that every line item in a restructuring model had a kitchen table somewhere. She hadn't known how to hold both. She wasn't sure she knew yet, but she was learning slowly, imperfectly, through cold coffee and 43-page files, and a drive to a house on Marjorie Street. She hadn't told anyone she was taking what it felt like to try. Her phone buzzed. Her 9 o'clock, pushed but still arriving. She picked up the phone. She put it back down. She looked at the photograph one more time. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went out to meet the day carrying the question with her, the way she'd started carrying it 11 days ago. Not lightly, not easily, but deliberately. The way you carry something you've decided you're not going to put down. He called at 8:15 the next morning. Not from the kitchen table this time. He was standing on the back porch of the house on Marjorie Street in the early morning cold with a cup of coffee that was still hot because he'd only just poured it. The rusted swing set stood in the yard, silver with dew. The sunflowers Maisie had planted in April were still growing, still green, still crowding each other in the narrow bed along the walk. He'd never thinned them out. He still couldn't bring himself to. Celeste answered on the second ring. I'll come back, Ethan said. Under the conditions we discussed. A pause on her end. Surprise exactly. She'd told herself not to assume either way, but something releasing. Okay, she said. I want to start with the review process, he said. Before anything else. Before the new role is formalized. Before any announcements. Before anyone talks about the new division. Review first. Agreed. And I want it done right. Not fast. I told Marcus the same thing, she said. He's already pulled 3 people from operations to work on it. People who actually knew these employees, not just HR staff reading numbers. He drank his coffee. I also want to talk to some of the people who were let go, individually, before we make any offers. She hesitated. That's going to be logistically. I know, he said. I'm not asking for all 412. I'm asking for the ones the review flags as priorities. The ones whose situations most closely parallel what happened to me. He paused. I want to hear from them before we decide what to offer. I don't want to design a support program without talking to the people it's supposed to support. The hesitation on her end was shorter this time. All right, and Celeste. He used her first name deliberately, not to establish something. Just because the kitchen table conversation had changed the register of things between them, and it would have been strange to go back. If the board pushes back on the open door fund, I need to know before it disappears from the plan. Not after. You'll know, she said. He stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the swing set. Monday then, he said. Monday, she said. He hung up. He stood there in the cold with his rusted swing set and his crowded sunflowers. And he breathed in the morning, and he thought about Claire, who would have had opinions about all of this sharp ones. Delivered at the kitchen table, over her second cup of coffee, with that particular precision she'd had. The ability to locate the exact nerve of a thing in about 30 seconds. She would have said something that made him laugh, and also made him think harder. He missed her the way he always missed her, not like an absence, because Absence implied something that had been removed, more like a presence that had shifted location. Still there, just not where he could reach it. He went inside and started making Maisie's lunch. Monday arrived with the specific feeling of things beginning, a triumphant beginning, not the kind with a swelling soundtrack and a newly pressed suit. Ethan wore the same dark blue jacket he'd worn to both meetings with Celeste, partly from lack of other options, and partly because he'd stopped caring about that particular signal. He took Maisie to school. She said good luck again at the car door. He said get in there again. The ritual was already establishing itself. He arrived at Northvale at 8:50. The receptionist on the third floor, the original third floor, no operational logistics, looked up when he came through the door, and her face did something complicated. Tanya, her name was. She'd worked the department desk for 6 years. She'd been one of the people who had looked away when he walked out with his cardboard box, and he'd understood it then, and he understood it now. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Then, quieter, "We heard you were coming back." "News travels," he said. "Is it true?" "What they're saying about the review." "What are they saying?" "That they're looking at everyone. That some people might be brought back." "That's what's happening," he said. "I can't tell you more than that right now, because I don't know more than that right now. But it's real." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was one he recognized, the particular combination of hope and wariness that people develop when they've been in a system long enough to know that announcements don't always become reality. "Okay," she said. "Okay." He took the elevator to the fourth floor, where Marcus Webb had set up a working space for the review team, a conference room repurposed, 3 long tables pushed together, files stacked in careful order, 2 operational staff, and a former HR director named Lena Chu, whom Marcus had called in specifically for this because she'd left Northvale 2 years ago under circumstances that suggested she'd understood the problems before Celeste had, and had grown tired of being the only one saying so. Marcus was already there when Ethan arrived, standing at the end of the table with a coffee and reading something. "Picked up Mercer," he said. "Webb," Ethan said. They shook hands. It was a brief, firm handshake, the kind between 2 people who respect each other and don't need to perform it. "Lena Chu Sun Chu," said the woman at the far end of the table, and she reached across and shook Ethan's hand without waiting for Marcus to introduce her. She was 53, small, with close-cropped gray hair, and the expression of someone who had been right about things for long enough that being right had stopped being satisfying and had become simply a working condition. "I've already read your file. The Hendricks contract alone should have had you on a fast track for director." "It was a different manager then," Ethan said. "It was the same culture," she said. "Different face, same machine." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you this so you know I'm not here to protect anyone's decisions. I left this company because I got tired of being managed around. I'm back because Marcus asked me, and because I think what you're trying to build might actually be worth the trouble. But I need you to understand that I'm going to tell you true things, even when they're inconvenient." "That's exactly why I asked for her," Marcus said from the other end of the table. "Good," Ethan said. He sat down and looked at the stacked files. "Then let's start with the true things. The review took 6 weeks, not because the team was slow, they weren't. They worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that real people with real bills and real families were waiting on the other side of every file they opened. It took 6 weeks because the work was genuinely complex. Each file required cross-referencing personnel records against department productivity data, against manager notes, against any flagged requests or interactions that might illuminate the gap between what the restructuring model had measured and what the person had actually contributed. Lena developed a classification system early in the 2nd week. She called it Direct, and she explained it to Ethan without apology. Files that were straightforward terminations positions, genuinely redundant, work genuinely replicated elsewhere. No evidence of systemic bias in the decision went in one stack. Files that showed a pattern of invisible contribution, denied accommodation requests, or decisions made by managers who had actively suppressed information that would have changed the outcome went in a 2nd stack. Files that were somewhere in the complicated middle went in a 3rd. The 2nd stack, by the end of week 2, had 61 files in it. 61. Ethan sat with that number at the end of a long Wednesday, after Marcus and Lena had gone home and the conference room was quiet and the files were stacked in their careful groups on the three pushed-together tables. He sat with it the way he'd sat at his kitchen table, with the bills not looking away from it, not softening it. 61 people. 61 situations where the model had failed because the model was measuring the surface and missing the substance. He pulled one file from the second stack and opened it. Sandra Okafor, 44 years old, 7 years in facilities management. 3 denied requests for schedule adjustment, not flexible work from home, nothing complicated, just a shift in her start time by 45 minutes to accommodate a dialysis transport for her husband, 3 mornings a week. All 3 denied by her supervisor, with the same language operational requirements. Sandra had arranged her own coverage for those mornings. She had covered her own gaps, arranged her own substitutes, never once left the department short. Her performance reviews were nearly identical to Ethan's. Reliable, meets expectations, no major concerns. She had been let go in the second wave of terminations, 4 weeks after Ethan. He looked at the contact information at the bottom of the file. He called her the next morning. She picked up on the 4th ring, cautious the way people answer unknown numbers when they're expecting a creditor. Miss Okafor, my name is Ethan Mercer. I work at Northvale Dynamics. I'm part of a team reviewing the recent restructuring terminations, and I'd like to speak with you, if you have time, about your experience. A long pause. Why, she said. Not hostile, just careful. Because I was also terminated in the restructuring, he said. He'd intervened. And because I think you deserved better than what happened, and I want to understand your situation before we discuss what we can offer. Their pause. Then you said you were also terminated. Then why are you calling from Northvale? I came back, he said. Under conditions. The review of terminated employees was one of them. She was quiet for a moment. He let her be quiet. What do you want to know? She said. He talked to Sandra Okafor for 47 minutes. He talked to her sitting at the conference room table with the file open in front of him and a legal pad where he wrote things down by hand, because he'd found in life that people trusted you more when they heard a pen moving. She told him about the 3 denied requests. She told him about the coverage she'd arranged herself, unpaid, because she couldn't afford to lose the job. She told him about the morning she was called into the office and handed the termination papers while her husband was at dialysis, and she was calculating in her head whether she could get to the appointment on time if she left immediately, or whether she'd have to call and tell him to get a ride. She'd gotten there on time. She hadn't told her husband about the job until the following day. I didn't want him to worry during treatment, she said. The stress isn't good for him. Ethan wrote that down. He talked to 19 people over the following 2 weeks. All of them were like Sandra. Some were more guarded. Some were too tired to be angry. Some were genuinely past it and had moved on and received his call with the polite but slightly impatient energy of people who had processed something and didn't want to reopen it. He respected all of it. He didn't push. But the ones who talked gave him something he couldn't have gotten from the files alone. They gave him the texture of it, the specific daily experience of being someone whose value was invisible and whose needs were inconvenient, and who had learned over months and years to make themselves smaller to survive inside a system that wasn't built with them in mind. He brought all of it to Celeste. She listened to all of it. That was the thing he hadn't been fully sure she was capable of, sitting still and listening to something difficult without her executive brain immediately pivoting to solutions and action items and the next step. But she did it. She sat across from him in her office, not behind her desk this time. In the two chairs the window that he'd noticed were positioned slightly differently than the meeting chairs, more facing each other, less across the table, and she listened. He talked for over an hour. He told her about Sandra Okafor and her husband's dialysis. He told her about Marcus Tillman, 57 years old, 22 years at Northvale, terminated 3 months before his pension vesting date in a timing that Lena had flagged in language unusually sharp for a review document. The proximity of this termination to the vesting date requires legal review before this file is closed. He told her about Yolanda Reyes, 31 years old, who had been on a performance improvement plan that her manager had initiated 2 weeks after she'd filed a formal request for maternity accommodation, a timeline that, when Ethan laid out the dates, made Celeste's jaw tighten visibly. He told her all of it. When he finished, she sat for a moment. "The pension situation," she said. "Marcus Tillman. Legal is already reviewing it," Ethan said. Lena flagged it on day 1. Marcus Webb escalated it directly. "That has to be made right immediately," she said. "In the review timeline, now." Agreed. The Reyes situation, she stopped. Was Paulson the manager? Different department. Similar pattern. She looked out the window. "How many managers in the company right now Zena have similars in their files?" "We haven't finished counting," Ethan said. "But Lena's estimate is more than you'd want to hear. Tell me anyway." She thinks it's systemic, not isolated to 2 or 3 people. She thinks the culture of managing families and personal circumstances as friction rather than human reality runs through most of the management layer because that's what the incentive structure rewarded. He paused. "She's not wrong." Celeste was quiet. "This is bigger than a review process," she said. Ethan said, "It is. And you knew that when you agreed to come back." He looked at her. "I suspected it. I didn't know the numbers." He paused. "The numbers are worse than I suspected." She stood up. Impatiently, she stood the way people stand when they need to move, because the weight of requires a different posture. She walked to the window and stood looking out at the financial district, at the gray afternoon sky, at the river in the distance. "The board meets in 3 weeks," she said. "I know. I'm going to present the full review findings, including the systemic pattern Lena identified, including Tillman, including Reyes." She paused. "Some of them are going to tell me this is a liability and we need legal cover, not a restructuring of management culture. Some of them will be right about the liability part," Ethan said. "Yes," she turned from the window. "And I'm going to tell them that the liability of doing nothing is larger. We've been hemorrhaging institutional knowledge for years without knowing it because we built a system that was very good at measuring certain things and completely blind to others, and that the cost of that blindness is sitting in 60 blinds is sitting in 61 files in a conference on the 4th floor, and we haven't even finished counting." He looked at her. "You've already decided," he said. "I decided when I read Sandra Okafor's file," she said. "You sent it over Tuesday night." He hadn't known she'd read individual files. He'd been sending summaries. "She arranged her own coverage," Celeste said. "Unpaid. For 3 mornings a week, for 7 months. And then she got let go anyway." "Yes," he said. "That's not a company I want to run," she said. It came out simply, without performance. Just a statement about who she was or was trying to be. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. The board meeting was not clean. 3 weeks later, in the long conference room on the 15th floor with its oval table and its city view and its particular atmosphere of money and impatience, Celeste presented the review findings to 9 board members who had approved the original restructuring, and who had, in several cases, been the source of the pressure that had driven it. Ethan was not in the room. He'd offered to be. Celeste had said no, not yet, that his presence would become the story rather than the findings, and she needed the findings to be the story first. He sat in his office, his actual office now, a proper one, on the 4th floor near the review team, and waited. Marcus Webb came and went twice during the 3 hours the meeting ran. Not with updates, just stopping in to check that Ethan was still there, which was Marcus's version of moral support. The 3rd time the door opened, it was Celeste. She looked tired, the tired of defeat, something more complicated than that. The tired of someone who had just spent 3 hours in a room, fighting for something, and hadn't entirely lost. She sat in the chair across from his desk. "The open door fund got cut in half," she said. "Initial allocation. I'm going to rebuild it over the next 2 quarters. But for now, it's half." "Okay," he said. "The mandatory management training passed. Unanimously, actually, nobody wanted the liability argument applied to them personally." She paused. "The flexible scheduling policy passed with a provision that I have to demonstrate measurable productivity impact within 12 months. That's manageable," he said. "Tillman gets his full pension. Legal agreed that the exposure is too significant." She paused. "We're also providing him back pay for the 3 months." Ethan breathed out slowly. "Good. The Reyes situation is going to legal review with a stronger recommendation." I think she'll be offered a settlement and her position back if she wants it. She may not want it, Ethan said. I know. That's her right. Celeste rubbed the back of her neck, a gesture he'd never seen from her before. A crack in the composure, small but visible. 38 of the 61 are being offered reinstatement or comparable new positions. The other 23 either have the situation in a category that requires more time or are in legal review. What about the ones who've already taken other jobs? We're reaching out individually, case by case. Some may want to come back. Some won't. We're offering transition packages to everyone in the 61, regardless more substantial than the original severance, with formal references and priority consideration. She looked at him. It's not everything. It's not. It's more than nothing. It is, he said. It's more than nothing. They sat with that for a moment. The gap between everything and more than nothing, the honest, uncomfortable distance between the ideal outcome and the one that was actually achievable inside a real institutions, with a real board and real legal constraints. Are you disappointed? She asked. He thought about it genuinely, the way she'd asked genuinely. Some, he said. In the direction? No. He paused. A month ago, this company was going to let 61 people disappear and never examine why. 38 of them have a path back, and the ones that don't have something real instead of just a termination letter. He looked at her. That's not nothing, Celeste. That's the difference between a company that sees its mistake and one that doesn't. She looked at him for a long moment. You're remarkably composed for someone who just sat out a board meeting that determined the shape of his own program, she said. I've had practice being composed in situations I don't control, he said. She said quietly. She stood up, straightened her jacket. The CEO composure came back, but it looked slightly different now than it had when he'd first walked into her office, with a cardboard box not looser but more inhabited, like the difference between someone wearing clothes that fit and someone wearing clothes that finally fit after a period of wearing the wrong size. The first management training session is scheduled for Thursday week, she said. I want you there. I'll be there. And Ethan. She stopped at the door. The open door fund, even at half allocation, it needs to launch. I don't want it sitting in a budget line while we wait for the full amount. People are in situations right now. Agreed, he said. Lena and I will have an operational plan by end of week. She nodded, she left. Ethan sat in his office in the quiet that followed and looked at the window, not the 14th floor window with the river view, just the 4th floor window with a view of the building across the street and a slice of gray sky at the top. It was a regular window in a regular office, and it was his. He picked up the phone and called Maisie's school. The school had a policy against student calls during the day, which Maisie frequently exploited by convincing office staff she was experiencing a minor emergency when she mostly just wanted to tell him something. He called the main office and left a message with the secretary. Tell Maisie everything went okay. Her dad says hi. The secretary sounded charmed in a slightly baffled way. He hung up. He pulled the draft operational plan for the open door fund toward him and uncapped his pen. The first employee to receive assistance from the open door fund was a man named Carl Esteban, 38 years old, who worked in data processing and whose car had broken down in the 3rd week of November, leaving him without transportation to a job that was 40 minutes from his apartment by a transit route that ran only until 9 at night. Carl had not asked for help. Carl had been quietly burning through his savings paying for ride shares until a coworker mentioned the fund almost in passing during a break room conversation. The way information travels inside companies sideways, accidentally, informal channels that no official communication ever fully replaces. Carl came to Ethan's office on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat in the chair across the desk with his hands on his knees and explained the situation in the flat, slightly defiant tone of a man who was not accustomed to asking for things and found the experience uncomfortable. Ethan listened. He did not offer advice. He did not suggest that Carl should have come sooner, or that the process would be easy, or that everything would work out. He asked a few clarifying questions, practical ones, and when Carl had finished, Ethan told him what the fund could provide, what the process was, what the timeline looked like, and what Carl would need to bring to the peer board for review. The peer board, Carl said. Who's on it? 3 of your coworkers, Ethan said. People at your level or 1 level up. not management. The fund was designed that way deliberately. Carl looked at him. So my manager doesn't know? Your manager doesn't have to know unless you choose to tell them, Ethan said. The fund operates independently. Carl was quiet for a moment. Why didn't this exist before, he said. It wasn't an accusatory question. It was genuine, the mild, tired bewilderment of someone who has spent years inside a system and encountered something that makes him wonder what else might have been possible. It should have, Ethan said. We're trying to make up for that. Carl nodded. He looked at his hands.
Okay, he said.
What do I need to bring? Ethan told him. Carl came back 3 days later. The peer board met on Thursday. The assistance was approved and in Carl's account by Friday afternoon enough to cover the car repair, with a small buffer for the ride shares he'd already paid.
No.
Yes, he'd intervened. When Ethan heard from Lena that the approval had come through, he was in the middle of reviewing the new management training curriculum. He put the curriculum down for a moment and sat with it, triumphantly, not with the feeling that something had been solved, with the feeling of something having started the first careful stitch in a thing that was going to need a lot of stitching before it held. Carl Esteban could get to work on Monday. That was real. Was one thing, one actual person on one actual Tuesday, sitting in a chair and asking for help with the slightly defiant tone of a man not used to asking and being heard. It was not the systemic transformation that Ethan had described to Celeste across her desk 2 months ago. Yes, he'd intervened. It was not the full open door fund or the completed management overhaul or the 38 reinstated employees all back in their positions, which was a process that was ongoing and complicated and frequently frustrating and moving at the speed of institutional change, which is to say slower than anyone wanted. But Carl Esteban could get to work on Monday. Ethan picked up the curriculum and kept reading. The management training started on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 6th floor. Ethan had helped design it with a consultant named Patricia Hennessy, who had spent 20 years working on workplace culture and who had the particular combination of warmth and precision that made difficult conversations feel survivable. The curriculum covered accommodation requests and how to evaluate them, how to identify invisible contribution, how to create paper trails that protected employees rather than just protected the company, and how to recognize when an employee's performance dip was a personal crisis rather than a capability gap. 14 managers attended the first session. Ethan recognized most of them. Some of them had been Paulson's peers. Some had been slightly above him in the chain. They sat in the conference room with the specific body language of people who had been required to attend something and hadn't decided yet whether to resent it or not. Patricia ran the first 90 minutes. Then she handed it to Ethan. He stood at the front of the room and looked at 14 faces, some guarded, some blank, a few genuinely curious, and he thought about what to say. He had prepared a speech. He'd thought about it and decided against it, because he knew the difference between prepared words and actual ones, and he knew which kind moved people and which kind they forgot before the elevator. I worked in this company for 8 years, he said. I requested a schedule adjustment 14 months ago so I could get my daughter to school and pick her up 2 days a week. The request was denied in under an hour. He paused. I made other arrangements. I always made other arrangements. He looked around the room. I want you to think about what that cost me. Not in terms of money or time. In terms of what I understood about whether this company saw me as a person or as a function. The room was quiet. A manager in the third row, a woman named Diane from supply chain who had attended as she'd been told to, and whose body language had been the most resistant when Ethan walked in, had shifted slightly in her seat. That's what we're talking about today, Ethan said. Policy compliance, not legal liability, though both of those matter. We're talking about whether the people who work for you know that you see them. He paused. Because the ones who know you don't, they stay anyway, usually. They make other arrangements. They keep their heads down and do their work, and they make other arrangements. He paused again. And you have no idea what it's costing them. Or you. Or this company. He talked for 45 minutes. When he finished, Patricia took questions. Most of them were genuine, practical, specific, the questions of people who were starting to think rather than just resist. A few were defensive. One manager asked whether the new accommodation policy created a precedent that employees could exploit. as Ethan said flatly. Some people will request accommodations they don't strictly need. That happens in every system with any flexibility built into it. He looked at the manager. The question is whether you design the system for the minority who might exploit it, or for the majority who genuinely need it and aren't asking because they're afraid of the answer. The manager didn't have a response to that. Diane from supply chain stayed after the session ended, and the others had filed out. She stood near the table, gathering her notebook, and then stopped. I denied a request last year, she said. Not to Patricia, to Ethan. An employee wanted to shift her hours to take her kid to therapy twice a week. She paused. I denied it because I thought it would create scheduling complications. I didn't really think about. She stopped. Is she still with the company? Ethan asked. She was let go in the restructuring, Diane said. Ethan looked at her. Was she in the 61? Diane looked uncertain. I don't know how to check. Come to the 4th floor after lunch, Ethan said. We'll look. Diane came after lunch. Her employee was in the 3rd stack, the complicated middle one, and her case was being reviewed. Ethan sat with Diane while Lena pulled the file, and the three of them looked at it together. Diane asked questions. Some of them were good questions. Some of them were questions she was asking because she was starting to understand something she hadn't let herself understand before, and understanding it was uncomfortable. And the questions were a way of moving through the discomfort rather than away from it. What happens now? Diane asked. The review team makes a recommendation, Lena said. If we recommend reinstatement, Celeste reviews it and makes the final call. If she wants to come back? Diane asked. My employee. If she wants to come back, does she report to me? Lena looked at her. Ethan looked at her. That would be a conversation, Ethan said carefully. Between you, her, and HR. Diane nodded. She looked at the file for a moment. I think I owe her an apology, she said, before anything else. Buddy argued with that. Ethan walked Diane back to the elevator. She was quiet in the way people are quiet when something has settled somewhere inside them and they're not sure yet what it means. At the elevator, she turned. Is this what you do all day? She asked. Just go through files and talk to people? Mostly, he said. It sounds exhausting, she said. It is, he said. It also doesn't feel like work the way the other kind felt like work. She considered that. The elevator opened. I'll send you the updated accommodation forms by end of week, she said. For my department, I'm going to reissue the standing guidance to my managers. I'll look for them, he said. She got in the elevator. The doors closed. Ethan stood in the 4th floor hallway for a moment, in the fluorescent hum of the building's ordinary afternoon, with the muffled sound of other people's conversations coming through closed doors, and the printer down the hall, cycling through a job, and the specific institutional smell of carpet and recycled air that he had stopped noticing years, and had started noticing again when he came back. He thought about the photograph on Celeste's desk. He thought about the 15 minutes it had taken to pack 8 years into a box. He thought about Sandra Okafor not telling her husband until the following day. Marcus Tillman, 3 months from his pension. Carl Esteban calculating rideshare costs at midnight. About Maisie's handwriting on the back of a photograph, uneven and careful, the letters of his still learning how to hold a pencil steady. He thought about all of it. Then he went back to his office and picked up the management training curriculum because the second session was in 4 days and there was still work to do, and the work was the point. And the work was where he lived now. He picked up his pen. He kept going. The anniversary crept up on Ethan the way most significant dates do, not announced, not dramatic, just suddenly present one morning when he was standing at the kitchen sink watching the backyard and realized he knew exactly what day it was without checking his phone. 1 year. 1 year since he'd packed 8 years into a cardboard box and taken the elevator to the 14th floor and left a photograph on the desk of a woman who hadn't known his name. He stood at the sink with his coffee hot this time. He'd gotten better at drinking it before it cooled, and he took stock of things the way you do when a year turns over. A formal accounting. Just a quiet internal inventory of what had changed and what hadn't, and what the difference felt like from the inside. The guttering on the house had been repaired in September, when Ethan's first full paycheck from the new role had given him enough margin to call the contractor he'd been putting off since spring. The porch step had been replaced in October. He'd done it himself on a Saturday morning, with Maisie handing him tools and providing running commentary on his technique that was both unhelpful and deeply entertaining. The electric bill no longer gave him chest pain. The credit card balance had been paid down to a number that was still uncomfortable, but was shrinking in a direction that felt sustainable rather than inevitable. The savings account had more than $2,312 in it. These were small things, but Ethan had learned, across a life that had asked him to be practical about what mattered, that small things were often the actual architecture of a life. The visible structures, the job title, the office, the program he'd helped build, those were real. But the guttering and the porch step and the savings account were what made the rest of it feel like solid ground rather than performance. Maisie was 9 now. She'd had her birthday. In July, a small party with 4 friends in the backyard that had involved a homemade cake Ethan had attempted from scratch and that had listed severely to one side despite 2 attempts to level it. Maisie had declared it perfect specifically because it was crooked, which was so thoroughly her mother's logic, that Ethan had had to look away for a moment. She was still drawing fish in the margins of everything. She had added sharks recently, which her teacher had noted in a Comfort woman who was not sure whether to be concerned or impressed and had settled on mentioning it. Ethan had said he'd talk to her. He hadn't talked to her. He figured the sharks were fine. He was thinking about all of this, the guttering, the sharks, the crooked birthday cake, when his phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Celeste. "Are you coming in this morning or working from home?" He looked at it. 6 months ago, Celeste Rowan would not have sent that text. 6 months ago, Celeste Rowan would have had her assistant send a calendar inquiry through the formal scheduling system. No. The text itself, casual, direct, the kind you send to someone you've stopped being formal with, was its own small measure of how much had shifted. Coming in, he texted back, "Give me an hour." He put the phone in his pocket, rinsed his mug, and went to wake Maisie. The 4th floor looked different than it had a year ago. Physically, the carpet was the same. The fluorescent lights still hummed at the same frequency. The printer down the hall still jammed every 3rd Tuesday, with a reliability that Ethan had come to find almost comforting. Yet he'd intervened, but the atmosphere had changed in the way atmospheres change when a place has been used differently long enough that the use becomes its character. The review team's conference room had been converted into the permanent home of what was now officially called the Employee Operations and Support Division, a name that Ethan had argued was too corporate and Celeste had argued was the most they could get past the board without triggering a values framework debate, and he'd accepted that logic because he understood the institutional reality of naming things. Chu had stayed. That had surprised him more than almost anything else in the past year. He'd expected her to consult for the weeks of the review and return to whatever she'd built for herself after leaving Northvale 2 years ago. Instead, at the end of week 4, she'd come into his office and sat down and said without preamble, "I want to stay, if you'll have me. But I need a real mandate, not a consultancy. I'm too old for consultancy." She was 53. She said this about herself regularly and without self-pity. He'd had her in the division full-time since then, running the peer review process for the Open Door Fund and the ongoing accommodation request pipeline, and she was the best thing that had happened to the program that he hadn't planned. She was direct in ways that made managers uncomfortable and productive in ways that made them come back anyway. She had no patience for bureaucratic padding and a long memory for which policies had failed and why. Sandra Okafor had come back. That was the one Ethan thought about most often. Sandra had been cautious when he'd called her, more cautious than she'd seemed on the phone. More cautious even than she'd seemed in their first in-person meeting, which had been 3 months into the review process when 38 reinstatements were being offered, and she'd sat across from Ethan with her hands folded and the expression of a woman who had been hoping for something and was actively managing. That hope, so it couldn't do too much damage if it fell through. She'd come back to a modified role in facilities, same level, different supervisor, with a formal flexible start time built into her employment agreement, a favor, not a special accommodation subject to managerial review, a written term of employment. Ethan had insisted on that. The thing that had failed Sandra the first time was the verbal, informal understanding. The yes, this should be fine nod from a previous manager that meant nothing when the landscape changed. This was paper. This was policy. She'd been back 7 months. Her husband's dialysis continued 3 mornings a week. She arrived at work at 9:15 on those mornings and left at 4:30. She had never once been late without notice. She had, in the 7 months since her return, caught 2 budget discrepancies in vendor invoices that saved the company a combined $62,000. She brought Ethan coffee sometimes when she passed his office. As a gesture of deference, Sandra was not a deferential person, but the way people bring coffee to someone they've decided to be easy with. He always said thank you, and she always said I know and walked back to her desk. Marcus Tillman had not come back. That was the harder one, and Ethan had needed to make peace with it over time. Tillman had been 57 years old when the company had terminated him 3 months before his pension vested, and by the time the legal review identified the problem, and Northvale made him whole, the pension reinstated, the back pay issued, a formal letter from Celeste that had taken Ethan 2 drafts to help her get right. Marcus Tillman had found a different kind of life. He'd moved to be closer to his daughter and her kids, consulted part-time for a nonprofit, and had, from what Ethan understood through Danny in accounting who stayed in touch with people, started gardening in a serious way. When Ethan had called to tell him about the settlement, Tillman had been quiet for a long time. I want you to know we know it was wrong, Ethan had said. And I want you to know that it's been corrected. I appreciate that, Tillman had said. Not warmly, not coldly. Just with the measured dignity of a man who had already reorganized his life around the reality of what happened and was receiving the correction as information rather than rescue. Will it happen to someone else? We're trying to make sure it doesn't, Ethan said. Trying, Tillman said. Yes, Ethan said, trying, for pause. That's honest, Tillman said. I'll give you that. They hadn't spoken since. Ethan thought about him sometimes, not with guilt exactly, because guilt required the belief that he personally could have prevented it, and he'd been out of the company when it happened, with the specific weight of a wrong that had been partially corrected and could not be fully corrected. Because the months Marcus Tillman had spent untethered from the pension he'd worked 22 years to earn existed in a permanent record that no settlement could erase. You could make a thing financially right. You couldn't give someone back the time they'd spent not knowing whether it would be, was the lesson Ethan carried most carefully. That making it right and making it not have happened were 2 entirely different things, and the tendency in institutions was to conflate them because the first was achievable and the second was not. Yolanda Reyes had settled. The details were confidential, which was the institution protecting itself in a way Ethan understood intellectually and found insufficient emotionally. She had not returned to Northvale. She had, from what the settlement attorney had indicated without being specific, moved to a different company in a different city and was doing well. Ethan hoped that was true. He had no way to verify it, which was itself a kind of loss. The person who had perhaps been most wronged was also the person he knew least about what had happened to afterward. He kept her file in a drawer in his desk, not as a reminder of failure, or not only that, as a reminder that some things end without resolution and you have to keep working anyway, because the point was never the clean ending. Was at his desk reading the quarterly report on the accommodation request pipeline, 47 requests submitted in the 3rd quarter, 39 approved, 6 in review, 2 declined and currently in appeal, when Celeste appeared in his doorway. She did this sometimes, appeared without her assistant, without a scheduled meeting, without the formal apparatus that surrounded most of her movements through the building. It had taken her longer to get comfortable with it than it had taken him to get used to it. She looked different than she had a year ago, in ways that were hard to quantify. She was still 30 years old, still the CEO, still the person in the building who carried the most weight and knew it. But the particular quality of how she carried it had changed. A year ago, she'd been composed in a way that was very good at repelling things. She was composed in a way that seemed more like she'd chosen to be steady rather than trained herself not to feel. It was the difference between armor and posture. Quarterly numbers came in this morning, she said. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which had also taken her a while. I saw, he said. Revenue's up. 11% over the same quarter last year, she said. Turnover is down 34% year on year. Productivity metrics across 5 departments show meaningful improvement. She paused. The board is pleased. Good, he said. They want to expand the open door fund, she said. Full original allocation plus 20%. He put his pen down. That's a turnaround. Math has a way of changing people's minds when the math is good, she said without irony. 3 executives who voted to cut the fund in half are now citing it as a retention strategy. She paused. I'm choosing to be grateful for the outcome, rather than irritated by the reasoning. That's growth, he said. Don't push it, she said, and there was something that was almost dry amusement in it, the particular register of a person who has gotten comfortable enough to be slightly wry. He smiled. She looked at the quarterly report on his desk. The appeal cases, she said. The 2 declined requests. I'm meeting with both employees next week, he said, and the managers involved. Separately first, then together, if that seems productive. Is one of them Hargrove's department? Yes. She made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. Hargrove. He's not Paulson, Ethan said. He's resistant, but he's not systematic about it. He's a manager who learned a certain way of managing and hasn't updated it, and nobody ever required him to. He paused. The training reached him. It just landed slowly. How slowly? He's getting there, Ethan said. Give him another quarter. If another quarter doesn't move him, then we have a different conversation, Ethan said. But I'd rather try the slower thing first. Celeste looked at him. You always want to try the slower thing first. The slower thing usually works better, he said. It's also more expensive in the short term. Everything that works is more expensive in the short term, he said. That's why companies keep choosing the fast thing and then paying for it later. She was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the building across the street caught the afternoon light along its upper floors, a horizontal strip of gold in the gray. I want to do something today, she said. If you have time, walk the building with me. The departments. The floors, she paused. I've been doing it once a month, but I usually go alone, and I think she stopped. Started again. I think I'd see it differently with you. He looked at her. You've been walking the departments once a month, he said. Since February, she said. Not announced. Just walking. She paused. Talking to people mostly. Or trying to. How's that going? She tilted her head slightly. Some people are still waiting for the catch, she said. They're polite, but they're watching to see what it costs them. That takes time, he said. I know. She looked at her hands briefly, a gesture he'd noticed she made when she was being honest about something that wasn't comfortable. I'm not very good at it yet. The small talk. The casual version of it. I come in and ask how people are doing, and I can see them recalibrating, trying to figure out if it's a test. It'll stop feeling like a test when it's consistent, long enough, he said. I know that too. She paused. I just want to be better at it faster. That's very you, he said. She gave him a look that might, in someone less controlled, have been an eye roll. Are you coming or not? He closed the quarterly report. Me get my jacket, he said. They started on the 2nd floor and worked up. Ethan had done variations of this before: the walking, the talking, the being present in the actual spaces where people spent their days. It was one of the things the management training had emphasized, not as a performance of accessibility, but as a genuine operational practice. You cannot understand what's not working in a system if you never encounter the system at the level where it breaks down. Walking with Celeste was different. She was, as she'd said, not naturally fluid at it. She stopped at desks with the slight stiffness of someone who knew the right moves intellectually and was executing them carefully rather than instinctively. She asked how people were doing and listened to the answers with visible attention, too visible sometimes, the focused listening of a person applying concentration rather than the easy half-attention of someone at ease. A few people were visibly nervous talking to her. A few were cautiously friendly. One woman in document processing named Bev, who had been at Northvale for 19 years and who had survived 3 CEOs and appeared to have developed a kind of organizational immunity to hierarchy, simply handed Celeste a form to review a paper jam and talk to her the way she'd talk to the temp from facilities. Celeste reviewed the paper jam diagnosis with the expression of a person who was genuinely uncertain whether she was being tested. It's the 3rd tray, Bev said. It always jams in the 3rd tray. I've put in 3 tickets. Nobody's fixed it. Who do the tickets go to? Celeste asked. Facilities, 3rd floor. Celeste looked at Ethan. I'll follow up today, he said. Bev looked at him, looked at Celeste, looked back at the printer, with the expression of someone who has heard this before. "'Kay," she said in a tone that was not quite skeptical and not quite hopeful, carefully positioned between the two. Printer was fixed by end of day. Ethan made sure of it, because a paper jam was a significant organizational issue, but because Bev had been told 3 times that it would be handled, and it hadn't been, and the specific accumulated weight of small, unkept promises was one of the main ways institutions taught people that what they needed didn't matter. A fixed printer was not a fixed culture. But a fixed printer was a fixed printer, and next time Celeste walked through document processing, Bev would know that the thing she said had been heard. That was how it worked. Not in grand gestures. In paper jams and schedule adjustments and accommodation forms and peer review boards and the slow, repetitive work of doing what you said you were going to do until people stopped waiting for the catch. On the 7th floor, a manager named Terrence stopped them in the hall. He was one of the 14 from the first management training session, not the most resistant, not the most converted. Somewhere in the productive middle where the training had given him a framework he was actively trying to apply. Mr. Mercer, he said, I wanted to let you know the accommodation request from Davis in my department. I approved it. I saw, Ethan said. Good call. I wanted to make sure his schedule adjustment gets entered into the system formally. The way you said. Written, documented. Lena will walk you through it, Ethan said. Call her this afternoon. Terrence nodded. He looked at Celeste with the slight formality of someone acknowledging authority, while not being quite sure of the register. Rowan. Good work, Celeste said. Direct brief. She was still learning how to calibrate the warmth of these moments. She tended to land on the efficient side, not because she was cold, but because she hadn't yet fully trusted that the warmth itself was appropriate, professional, wanted. It was one of the ways in which she was still becoming someone different from who she'd been. He took the elevator to the 14th floor at the end of the walk. In her office, Celeste poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on her credenza. She'd stopped keeping it exclusively for meetings. Another small shift, and handed one to Ethan. They stood near the window for a moment, rather than sitting. The city was going golden in the late afternoon, that specific hour when the light came in, flat and warm, and made everything look briefly like a painting of itself. Bev's going to tell everyone about the printer, Celeste said. Yes, Ethan said. She will. Is that good? Depends on whether it stays fixed, he said. Celeste looked at him sideways. I'm serious, he said. One fixed printer, people talk. 2 weeks later, it jams again and nobody follows up. People talk louder. He paused. Consistency is the whole thing. It sounds simple, and it is the hardest part, she said. She looked out the window. The board wants me to present the division's results at the annual shareholder meeting. Full presentation. Retention numbers, productivity data, the open door fund outcomes. That's good, he said. They want to frame it as a strategic initiative, she said. An innovation in human capital management. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want to frame it as? He asked. She turned from the window slightly. What I actually think it is, she said, which is what happens when a company is forced to look at what it was doing to people and decides to stop. The board won't love that framing. No, she agreed. Which is why I'm going to spend the next 3 weeks finding the version that's honest and also something they can live with. She paused. I'd like your help with that. Okay, he said. They stood there for a moment in the afternoon light. The city went on below them. Traffic and people, and the river in the distance, of a place where millions of people were doing the work of their lives, with varying degrees of support and visibility. Ethan, Celeste said. Yeah, what day is it today? Specifically. He looked at her. He'd wondered if she knew. You know what day it is, he said. I do, she said. I put it in my calendar a month ago. The date you walked out. She paused. I wanted to mark it somehow. I wasn't sure how. He looked at the corner of her desk. The photograph was there. Exactly where it had been the night she'd read his file. Exactly where it had been the morning he'd come back. She'd had it framed at some point in the past year, not elaborately. A simple, dark frame. The kind you buy because you want the thing inside it to stay undamaged. It sat between a corporate award that Ethan knew she'd received at an industry dinner in March and a small potted plant that he also knew she frequently forgot to water, and that Lena had started watering without comment. "I left that as a goodbye," he said. "I know," she looked at it. "It didn't work very well as a goodbye." "No," he said. "It didn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as something I mean, not as something I'm saying, because it's the right thing to say." He waited. "You changed this company," she said. "Not me. The board decision. Not the quarterly numbers. Not the management training curriculum." She paused. "You did it by being exactly what you were, not dramatic about it, not demanding about it. You just refused to be erased quietly, and then you came back and did the work." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know that I see that I see the specific, particular thing that is you doing this work, and I am not going to make the mistake of letting it disappear into a departmental achievement." He held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "I also want to say—" She stopped. "I've thought about how to say this, and I don't have a good version, so I'm going to say the imprecise version." She looked at the photograph. "I didn't know what I was missing, as a leader, until I had to look at what you were carrying as a person. And I couldn't have told you that a year ago, because a year ago I didn't have the vocabulary for it." She paused. "The same CEO I was. I'm not sure I'm a good one yet, but I'm trying in a different direction." "You're a better one," Ethan said. "You were always capable. You were just missing information." "What information?" He looked at the photograph, at Maisie's face, at his own face laughing at something off camera that he still couldn't remember. Some passing thing that was already gone by the time the shutter clicked, a moment that existed now only in evidence. "That the people below you are carrying things you can't see," he said. "What they carry affects everything, what they produce, how long they stay, what they're capable of when they're supported, and what they lose when they're not." He paused. "You knew how to run a company. You didn't know how to see it." She was quiet. "And now," she said, "now you're learning," he said. "You're not done. Neither am I. Neither is the company." He paused. "We're going in the right direction, and that matters. And the people who know the difference are the ones who've been here long enough to have felt both." Celeste looked at the photograph for a long time. "Keep it," he said. "It has a job to do." She looked at him. "It already did its job," she said. "It did its first job," Ethan said. "The next one is to stay there on your desk, on the days when the board is pushing hard, and the numbers are tight, and the easy answer is to revert to the old way. On those days, it has a different job." She understood what he meant. He could see her understanding it. "I'll keep it," she said. Maisie's school performance was that evening. He'd known about it for 2 months, had it in his phone calendar with 3 separate reminders, had planned the day around it with the particular organized care of a single father who has learned from experience that school performances wait for no one, and that "I had a meeting" is not a sentence a 3rd grader finds acceptable. He left the building at 5:15. Celeste walked him to the elevator, which she didn't normally do, and at the elevator door she said, "Tell Maisie good luck. She'll say she doesn't need it," he said. "She's probably right," Celeste said. He took the elevator down. He drove across town through the early evening traffic with the radio on something easy, thing that required attention, and he thought about the year in the way you think about things when you have 40 minutes of driving and a quiet brain and a specific kind of tiredness that is the tiredness of work. That mattered, rather than work that simply continued. He thought about Sandra Okafor arriving at work at 9:15 on dialysis mornings, with the formal written terms of her employment in a file where anyone could find them. He thought about Carl Esteban's car, fixed, sitting in whatever parking lot he used. He thought about Diane from Supply Chain, and the employee she'd asked about, and the apology she'd said she owed, which Ethan knew had been delivered because Lena had mentioned it in passing, casually, the way you mention something you've noted without making a monument of it. He thought about Marcus Tillman gardening somewhere, closer to his grandchildren, in a life that hadn't been the plan, but had become a life nonetheless. He thought about the 61 files, 38 paths back, the rest in their various complicated states of partial resolution and ongoing process, and the honest imperfection of what institutions can actually do when they try in good faith, but under real constraints. He thought about Yolanda Reyes, somewhere in a different city, and hoped with the specific, unverifiable hope you carry. For people you can't follow that she was okay. He thought about the management training curriculum that was in its fourth cycle now, that had touched 63 managers, that would need another revision, because Lena had identified 3 gaps in the accommodation section, was not perfect, and was better than what existed before, which was nothing. He thought about the photograph on Celeste's desk. He thought about leaving it as a goodbye. He thought about how comprehensively that had failed to be a goodbye. He pulled into the school parking lot at 6:47, which was 13 minutes before the performance started, which was exactly the margin he'd planned for. Was not naturally a 13 minutes early person. He had become one, because Maisie's face, when she found him already seated, already there, was worth whatever organizational effort it required. He found a seat in the 3rd row. The auditorium filled around him, other parents, grandparents, smaller siblings held firmly by the wrist, the restless shuffling of families waiting for the performance to begin. The stage was set with paper props and construction misery. The specific, cheerful, handmade quality of things assembled by children who had done their best and were going to be seen doing their best, and that was the whole point. He sat in the 3rd row with his hands loose in his lap and thought about something Maisie had said months ago now, over dinner. They'd been talking about his work. She asked about it regularly now, not because she fully understood it, but because she decided it was interesting, which was Maisie's particular gift, the ability to find things interesting as a decision, rather than a feeling. He'd been describing the accommodation request pipeline, or a simplified version of it, and she'd been eating with the focused efficiency of a child who considers sitting still for meals a necessary tax on an otherwise active existence. "You make sure people can ask for help," she'd said. "That's part of it," he said. "And they get help?" "When we can, most of the time." She'd considered this, chewing. "That's a good job," she said. Not impressed, particularly. Just stating a fact the way she stated facts. Matter of fact and final. "I think so," he said. "Better than the old one?" He'd looked at her across the kitchen table, at the gap between her front teeth that had been there since the first one fell out in January, and the permanent tooth was coming in crooked, and they were going to need to talk to the dentist about it. At the marker on her wrist from a drawing she'd done at school that hadn't fully washed off. At the dolphin, which had been demoted from constant companion to occasional guest at the dinner table, but was still in the house, still present. Different, he'd said. Better different or worse different, he said. Harder, but better. She'd nodded, satisfied, and gone back to her food. Sitting in the 3rd row of the school auditorium, Ethan thought about that conversation and understood that harder but better was about as accurate a summary of the past year as he could manage. He had not arrived somewhere finished. He was not a man who had solved things and could now coast. The work was ongoing and imperfect and regularly frustrated him and occasionally made him want to close his office door and sit quietly for 5 minutes. Yes, he'd intervened, which Lena had started providing for him by the simple method of telling his calendar assistant to block the 5 minutes after difficult meetings. He was not a perfect father. He burned the occasional dinner and forgot field trip permission slips, and once, memorably, showed up to parent-teacher conference night on the wrong date. He still talked to Claire sometimes in the way you talk to people who are gone, not out loud, but in the internal conversation that doesn't stop just because one side of it is no longer answering. He still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with the specific free-floating anxiety of a person who has known what it is to not know how the bills are going to be paid. And even though the bills were being paid now, the body remembered the other time and periodically sent the alarm anyway. He was not a man who had been transformed into something better and complete. He was a man who had been fired and had left a photograph and had come back and had done the work and was sitting in the 3rd row of his daughter's school auditorium at 6:54 on a Thursday evening. Was all. That was everything. The lights dimmed. The curtain moved. Maisie walked out 3rd from the left in a line of 9-year-olds, wearing the green costume they'd spent 2 weekends constructing, her hair in braids that were uneven because she'd done them herself and refused assistance, her chin slightly raised in the way she had when she was nervous, and converting the nervousness into something that looked like confidence because she'd been watching her father do that her whole life. yet and had absorbed the technique without knowing it. She was looking for him. He could see her eyes scanning the audience, the quick sweep of a child looking for the specific face that means safe in the particular vocabulary of people who love each other. He raised his hand. She found him. Her face did the thing it did, the specific, unguarded thing, the loosening, the smile that was not a perform but the involuntary kind that happens when you find the person you were looking for, when the room full of strangers suddenly has the one face in it that makes it not a room full of strangers. She gave him a small nod. He nodded back. She turned to face the stage. He sat in the third row of the auditorium and watched his daughter prepare to be seen, and he thought about what she'd written on the back of a photograph in the careful, uneven letters of a child, still learning how to hold a pencil. My dad always fixes things. He wasn't sure that was true. He hadn't fixed everything. He hadn't fixed Northvale entirely, and wooden companies were not the kind of thing that got fixed. They were the kind of thing that got better or worse, depending on whether the people inside them kept paying attention. He hadn't brought back everyone who should have come back. He hadn't reached Marcus Tillman in time for it to matter to his timeline. He hadn't made Yolanda Reyes whole. He was a man with limitations working inside an institution, with limitations trying to do better than the last version, which was the most any of them could honestly claim. But he had fixed some things. He had fixed enough. And maybe that was what Maisie had understood with the simple accuracy that children sometimes have for the true shape of their parents. Not that he fixed everything, but that when something was broken and it was within his power, and he had not been beaten down too far to try, he tried, and kept trying. Even when he was sitting alone at a kitchen table at 30 at night, with bills he didn't know how to pay, and a daughter asleep down the hall, he kept trying. That was the thing that was true. The performance started. Maisie sang. She was not the best singer in the group. She was somewhere in the middle, her voice clear but not exceptional, carrying the melody with the focused determination of someone who has practiced and is going to deliver what she practiced, regardless of whether the acoustics cooperate. She forgot one word in the second verse and replaced it seamlessly with a different word that fit the rhythm, and probably didn't fit the lyric, which was so entirely Maisie's approach to difficulty that Ethan had to press his lips together to keep from laughing. He watched her for the full 23 minutes of the performance. He did not check his phone. He did not think about the quarterly report, or the Hargrove situation, or the board presentation on the Open Door Fund. He sat in the third row and watched his daughter stand on a stage and be seen, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Afterward, in the hallway outside the auditorium, Maisie found him in the crowd the same way she'd found him in the audience, the same scanning looks, the same loosening when she landed on him. She walked toward him with her costume still on, and her braids coming slightly undone, and her face carrying the particular open energy of a performance high, the way children are right after they've done something in front of people, and it went okay. I forgot a word, she said immediately. I noticed, he said. I fixed it, though. You did, he said. She looked up at him. Was it good? He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, green costume, uneven braids, one word improvised in the second verse, standing in the hallway of her school asking him whether it was good, and he felt something that was not quite any single thing but was all the things at once. The year behind them, and the bills that were paid now, and the photograph on the desk, and the people who had come back, and the people who hadn't, and the rusted swing set in the backyard, and the crooked birthday cake, and the kitchen table, where the hard conversations happened, and the cold coffee that was always waiting to be drunk while there was still time. It was really good, he said. She took his hand. They walked out of the school together into the evening air, which was cool and clear, the kind of fall night that smells like leaves, and something closing down, and something else, somewhere in the same breath, about to begin. Maisie talked the whole way to the car, about the performance, about the word she'd fixed, about how Emma in the front row had tripped on her own costume and recovered beautifully, about whether they could stop for ice cream even though it was a school night, about something a teacher had said that she disagreed with and was constructing her argument against. Ethan listened. Ethan listened. He listened to all of it, and placed it between them on its school parking lot and the where Marjorie Street met the corner with the amber streetlight. Walking next to his daughter in the clear fall evening, he understood something that he hadn't quite been able to put into words before, something that the Menschen teaching him in the slow, patient way that real things are taught. No, he had lost his job. He had sat at a kitchen table and cried into his hands. He had left a photograph as a goodbye that became instead a beginning. He had come back to a company that had failed him and tried to help it become something that wouldn't fail the next person the same way. He had not been saved by a billionaire's recognition of his worth. Had saved something himself, not dramatically, not completely, not in the version where every wrong gets righted and every number adds up. In the real version, where 61 people had different outcomes, and some of them were good and some were partial. And one of them was Marcus Tillman gardening closer to his grandchildren, which was a kind of good that didn't look like what anyone had planned. In the real version, where a company was slowly becoming less wrong than it had been, one accommodation request and one fixed printer and one management training session and one peer review board at a time. In the real version, which was the only version there was, Maisie tugged his hand. "Are we getting ice cream or not?" "It's a school night," he said. "That's not an answer." He looked down at her. "Yeah," he said. "We're getting ice cream." She grinned the full, gap-toothed, unguarded grin that was entirely her own. They turned the corner together. The streetlight was warm. The night was clear. And Ethan Mercer, 33 years old, walked home with his daughter through the particular ordinary brightness of an evening that asked nothing of him except to be present for it, which was, in the end, the thing he was best at.